Close your eyes, breathe slowly. Tonight, across centuries and continents, the greatest minds in human history have something to tell you, not as monuments, not as names in textbooks, but as people who struggled, doubted, failed, and found their way through and left behind in their own words and their own lives something that still holds true. Let these voices carry you gently into rest. This is Explore During Sleeping. Lesson 1. Marcus Aurelius. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Marcus Aurelius was, by any measure, one of the most powerful men who ever lived. He commanded the largest empire on earth, led armies into brutal campaigns along the Danube frontier, and held in his hands the fate of millions. And yet the work he is most remembered for was never meant to be read by anyone but himself. The Meditations, written in stolen moments between military campaigns, in tents, in the cold margins of an emperor's impossible life, is a private journal of a man arguing with himself about how to be good, not how to appear good, how to actually be good in the moments when no one was watching and everything was going wrong. Aurelius inherited an empire already fraying at the edges. Plague swept through Rome during his reign, killing millions. Wars pressed from the north and east simultaneously. Political treachery was a permanent feature of court life. His own co-emperor and adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, died young. His wife's reputation was attacked. His son, Commodus, would go on to become one of Rome's most erratic rulers. The pressures on him were not abstract. They were constant, physical, and unrelenting. And still, night after night, he returned to the same question: what is actually within my control? His answer, drawn from the Stoic philosophy he had studied since youth, was radical in its simplicity. The only thing you ever truly own is your own mind, the way you choose to interpret what happens to you, the values you decide to act from, the attention you decide to give. Everything outside that, reputation, outcome, other people's behavior, even your own body, is borrowed. It can be taken. It will be taken eventually, but your response, your orientation, your inner yes or no, that is yours. He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." He didn't write this as a man who had mastered it. He wrote it as a man who was still trying, still failing, still beginning again the next morning. That is what makes it true. Not the philosophy of a saint, but the discipline of someone ordinary enough to forget and honest enough to remind himself again. Tonight, whatever is pressing on you from the outside, the outcomes you cannot control, the people you cannot change, the circumstances that will not bend to your wanting, let them rest at the edge of the room. They are real, but they are not you. The part of you that decides how to meet them, that is still free. That has always been free. Marcus Aurelius knew it not because life was easy for him, but because it wasn't. Lesson 2. Epictetus. The obstacle is the training. Epictetus was born a slave. This is not a footnote to his philosophy, it is the foundation of it. He had no citizen's rights, no property, no legal protection over his own body. According to one account, his master once twisted his leg as a demonstration of power, and Epictetus responded calmly, warning that the bone would break. It broke. He said simply, "I told you so." Whether the story is precisely true or not, it captures something real about the man, a person who had understood, at the deepest possible level, that what happens to your body and what happens to your soul are two entirely different things. After being freed, Epictetus became one of the most sought-after teachers in the ancient world. Students traveled from across the Roman Empire to sit in his school in Nicopolis. He owned almost nothing, lived in a small house, and by all accounts turned away wealthy patrons who wanted a private education. What he taught was not comfort, it was clarity. He drew the sharpest possible line between what is up to us, our judgments, desires, the direction of our will, and what is not up to us, everything else. The body, reputation, wealth, other people. He called this distinction the dichotomy of control, and he returned to it in every lesson from every angle, until it became not an idea but a reflex. What made Epictetus extraordinary was that he had not arrived at this through privilege or study alone. He had lived it under the most extreme conditions a person can face. Slavery is the systematic removal of control over your time, your movement, your relationships, your future. And yet within that total external constraint, Epictetus found something that could not be reached by any master: the capacity to choose his own response, not to pretend the suffering didn't exist. Not to perform contentment, but to refuse to let external circumstances determine the orientation of his inner life. He taught that difficulty is not a detour from the path of growth, it is the path. The obstacle does not delay the training. The obstacle is the training. Everything that resists you, everything that humiliates you or strips away what you thought you needed, is showing you what you are made of and what you are capable of becoming. This is not a comfortable idea. Epictetus never promised comfort. He promised something rarer, a life in which nothing outside you could take away what mattered most. Tonight, if something has been pressing on you, some loss or frustration or failure you keep returning to, consider that it may not be in your way. It may be your way. Lesson 3. Leonardo da Vinci. curiosity is itself a kind of genius. Leonardo da Vinci left behind some of the most famous paintings in human history, and also some of the most unfinished projects. He was commissioned for work he never completed, distracted himself constantly, and spent years on studies that had no immediate practical application. The flight of birds, the movement of water, the structure of the human heart, the way light falls on a curved surface at dusk. By conventional measures of productivity, he was a catastrophic employee. By any other measure, he was perhaps the most curious human being who ever lived. His notebooks, thousands of pages, written in mirror script, filled with diagrams and questions and observations and half-finished thoughts, reveal a mind that could not stop asking. Not just how does this work, but why does this look the way it looks? What would happen if? Has anyone noticed that? He had no formal university education. He taught himself anatomy by dissecting corpses in secret, at a time when the church restricted such access. He taught himself engineering by studying machines, and then imagining better ones. He taught himself geology, botany, optics, and music not because he had to, but because each question led naturally to the next, and he could not bear to leave any of them unanswered. What Leonardo models is something deeper than intelligence in the narrow sense. He models what happens when a person takes their curiosity seriously enough to follow it past the point of usefulness, past the point of social approval, into territory that no one around them cares about yet. His aeronautical sketches preceded powered flight by 4 centuries. His anatomical drawings were more accurate than the medical texts of his era. He arrived at these things not through genius alone, but through a quality of sustained, almost childlike attention that he never allowed the adult world to train out of him. He wrote in his notebooks, "The noblest pleasure is the joy of understanding, not the joy of being recognized, not the joy of completing something, the joy of understanding itself, the moment when something that was opaque becomes clear, when a pattern surfaces, when the world reveals a small piece of its logic." He believed this joy was available to anyone who was willing to pay close enough attention. Tonight, let yourself remember something you were once curious about, something you wanted to understand not because it was useful, but because it pulled at you. That pull was not a distraction, it was a direction. Lesson 4, Marie Curie. Persistence in the face of exclusion is its own discovery. Marie Curie was not supposed to be a scientist. She was a woman in the 19th century, born in Poland under Russian occupation, with no legal access to university education in her home country. She studied in secret, first through an underground network of women called the Flying University, meeting in private homes, moving locations to avoid police detection, and then by making an arrangement with her sister. One would work to fund the other's studies in Paris, and then they would trade. Marie worked as a governess for years, saving money, waiting. She arrived in Paris at 24, alone with almost nothing, and enrolled at the Sorbonne. She graduated first in her physics degree and second in mathematics. She then began research that would define the rest of her life. Working in a converted shed, leaking in rain, freezing in winter, alongside her husband Pierre, she processed tons of pitchblende ore by hand, stirring boiling material with an iron rod, breathing in substances she did not yet know were slowly damaging her body. She was searching for the source of a phenomenon she had named radioactivity. After years of labor, she isolated 2 new elements, polonium, named for her occupied homeland, and radium. She became the first woman to win a Nobel Prize. Then, after Pierre died in a street accident, she became the first person ever to win a second Nobel Prize in a different scientific discipline. What the official version often omits is the resistance she faced at every step. The French Academy of Sciences never admitted her. She failed election by 1 vote, and many members voted against her solely because of her gender. When she was awarded the Nobel the second time, a scandal about her private life erupted, and some suggested she not attend the ceremony. She attended anyway. She delivered the lecture. She received the prize. She did not apologize for existing in a space that had tried to keep her out. Her life teaches something precise, that the barriers placed in front of you by institutions or by other people's fear of what you represent are not evidence that you do not belong. They are evidence of the institution's limitation, not yours. She wrote, "Nothing in life is to be feared, it is only to be understood." She lived that sentence under conditions designed to make her afraid. Tonight, if there is something you have been told, implicitly or directly, that you are not supposed to want, let her life sit with you a little. She wanted it anyway, and the world is permanently different because she did. Lesson 5, Viktor Frankl. Meaning can be found even in suffering. Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist in Vienna when the war came for him. He had already developed the outlines of a new approach to therapy, one centered not on pleasure or power as the primary human drive, but on meaning. Then he was deported to Auschwitz, and everything he had theorized was tested against the most extreme conditions human beings have ever deliberately created for one another. He lost his wife, his parents, his brother. He was subjected to forced labor, starvation, medical experiments, and the constant, deliberate humiliation that was the architecture of the camp system. He watched people around him give up and die not from physical causes alone, but from the interior collapse that happened when a person could no longer find any reason to endure the next hour. And he watched others, in conditions no less brutal, find something to hold on to. A memory. A person they were living for, a task only they could complete, a fragment of meaning in a place that had been designed to be meaningless. What he observed became the core of what he would later call logotherapy, the idea that the primary human motivation is not the avoidance of pain, but the search for meaning, and that meaning is available even inside suffering. Not because suffering is good, not because it should be accepted passively, but because the one freedom that cannot be taken from a human being, even in a concentration camp, even in the final extremity, is the freedom to choose how to relate to what is happening. To find or make or protect some fragment of inner orientation that the external world cannot reach. After liberation, he rewrote from memory the manuscript that had been destroyed, the book that would become man's search for meaning, one of the most widely read books of the 20th century. He returned to Vienna and rebuilt his career. He continued to practice and teach until he was in his 90s. He wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." He was not speaking abstractly. He was speaking from the ruins of everything, and he found in those ruins not comfort but something sturdier, a reason to continue, and a deep conviction that every human life, no matter how constrained, retains the capacity to say yes to something. Tonight, if something in your life feels without purpose or without exit, let his voice reach you across the distance. The search for meaning is not a luxury, it is the most human thing you can do. Lesson 6, Frederick Douglass. Education is the path from darkness to light. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery in Maryland, the son of an enslaved woman and an unknown white man, almost certainly his enslaver. He was separated from his mother in infancy, which was common practice, designed to prevent the formation of bonds that might complicate the system's operation. He did not know his own birthday. He had no legal name that was his own. He was, in the eyes of the law, property. When he was around 12 years old, the wife of the household where he was living began teaching him to read. Her husband stopped it immediately, explaining in words that Douglass would remember for the rest of his life, that a literate slave would become unmanageable, dissatisfied, unfit for slavery. Douglass heard this and understood it as the most important information he had ever received. If reading made a person unfit for slavery, then reading was the path out. He taught himself in secret, trading bread to white children in the neighborhood in exchange for lessons, studying in stolen minutes, hiding what he knew. He escaped north at 20 years old, carrying forged papers. He arrived in New York with almost nothing and began to speak. His voice, direct, precise, devastating in its detail, drew crowds who could not believe that this man had been a slave. Some doubted it. He was too articulate, they said, too composed. He responded by writing his autobiography, naming his enslaver, naming the plantation, providing every detail that could be verified. He risked recapture to prove that what he said was true. For the rest of his long life, he wrote and lectured and argued and negotiated, meeting with Lincoln in the White House, pushing the country toward the promises it had made and not kept. He said, "Once you learn to read, you will be forever free." He did not mean this only literally. He meant that knowledge, once genuinely absorbed, changes the structure of a person's inner life in ways that no external force can reverse. They can take your freedom. They cannot take what you understand. Tonight, let that idea stay with you. Whatever you have learned, whatever has opened the world to you, is yours in a way that nothing else is. No one can reclaim it. Lesson 7, Nikola Tesla. The visionary who works alone sees farther. Nikola Tesla arrived in New York in 1884 with 4 cents in his pocket, a poem he had written, and a letter of introduction to Thomas Edison. The letter said, reportedly, that the bearer was a first-rate man. Edison gave him work. Within months, the two had fallen out over money, over recognition, over a fundamental disagreement about how the future of electricity should be built. Tesla believed in alternating current. Edison had committed everything to direct current. The war between them, literal and commercial, would define the next decade of electrical history, and Tesla would ultimately be proven right. But being right did not protect him. Tesla's life is one of the most striking examples in history of a mind that ran so far ahead of its time that the world could not catch up fast enough to provide for him. He invented the alternating current motor and transmission system that now powers the modern world. He developed early radio transmission, wireless communication, and remote control, all before they were named, before the infrastructure existed to support them. He held over 300 patents. He imagined systems for transmitting electricity wirelessly across the globe, without wires or cables, a project he pursued until his funding ran out and his tower was demolished. He was also deeply eccentric, profoundly solitary, and notoriously difficult to work with on terms other than his own. He never married, he kept odd hours. He worked in long solitary stretches punctuated by extraordinary bursts of vision. He said he could visualize inventions so completely in his mind, running them, testing them, adjusting them, that when he finally built a physical model, it was merely a formality. The real work had already happened in the space behind his eyes. He wrote, "The present is theirs, the future for which I really worked is mine." He said this late in life, when recognition had largely moved on to others. There is something both melancholy and serene in it, the statement of a person who had decided, long ago, that the work mattered more than the reward, and who held to that even when the reward did not come. Tonight, if you are working on something that no one around you quite understands yet, let Tesla's long patience be a companion. The future has always belonged to the people willing to live in it before it arrives. Lesson 8, Harriet Tubman. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is moving anyway. Harriet Tubman escaped slavery alone at night, navigating by the North Star through territory where every person she encountered could legally return her to bondage or claim the reward on her head. She reached Philadelphia and was for a moment free. Then she went back, 19 times. She returned to the same territory, the same risk, the same darkness, and brought out over 70 people, never losing a single one. She said later that she never ran her railroad off the tracks. She was not speaking metaphorically. The physical conditions of her life before escape were brutal in ways that are difficult to hold in the mind. She had been hired out as a child to neighbors who beat her. As a teenager, she was struck in the head with a 2-pound metal weight thrown by an overseer at another slave, not at her, but the weight hit her, and the resulting brain injury caused her to lose consciousness without warning for the rest of her life. She would simply fall asleep mid-sentence, mid-action, and wake again. She managed these episodes, planned around them, and refused to let them stop her. During the Civil War, she served as a spy for the Union Army, the first woman in American history to lead an armed raid, the Combahee River Raid, which liberated more than 700 enslaved people in a single night. After the war, she returned to Auburn, New York, cared for her parents, took in boarders, and spent her final decades working for women's suffrage. She died in 1913, in her 90s, surrounded by friends and family, her last words reportedly an instruction to those gathered around her: "We must go." She said once, "I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." The pride in that sentence is enormous and earned, but what runs beneath it is something quieter, the understanding that courage is not a feeling. It is a practice. It is showing up in the dark again and again, not because the fear is gone, but because something else is stronger than the fear. Tonight, whatever it is you are afraid of doing, remember that she was afraid too. She moved anyway. That is the whole of it. Lesson 9, Fyodor Dostoevsky. Suffering understood becomes compassion. Fyodor Dostoevsky was led out to be executed on a winter morning in 1849. He was 27 years old, a novelist who had published one celebrated book and was now condemned for participating in a socialist reading circle. He stood in the square in St. Petersburg, dressed in a white execution shirt, watching his fellow prisoners be prepared for the firing squad. The order was given, the rifles were raised. And then a courier arrived on horseback with a pardon from the Tsar. The execution was a staged performance of mercy, a deliberate psychological torture dressed as clemency. He was sent instead to 4 years of hard labor in Siberia, followed by years of forced military service. He lived in a prison barracks with common criminals, murderers, thieves, men who had done things he found incomprehensible. He had expected to feel superior to them. Instead, he was transformed by them. He began to understand in the most physical and immediate way that suffering was not a mark of moral failure. That the human soul, in any condition, in any person, retained a complexity that resisted simple judgment. That cruelty and tenderness, guilt and grace, could live in the same human being at the same time. He returned to St. Petersburg with epilepsy, in debt, and began to write the books that would make him one of the most important novelists in human history. Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, The Brothers Karamazov, all of them circling the same questions he had been forced to face in that prison yard. What does a human being owe to another? What is guilt? What is forgiveness? Is redemption possible, and at what cost? He wrote, "Pain and suffering are always inevitable for a large intelligence and a deep heart." He was not celebrating suffering. He was observing that the people who feel most deeply, who are most alive to the weight of the world, are also the most exposed to its difficulty. The sensitivity that makes you suffer is the same sensitivity that makes you capable of understanding others. Tonight, if you are carrying something heavy, let Dostoevsky's long witness sit with you. What you feel is not a weakness. It may be the most human thing about you. Lesson 10, a reflection on the first 9 voices. 9 minds have spoken tonight, 9 lives that crossed centuries, continents, and circumstances no 2 of them could have predicted. An emperor writing to himself in a war tent, a freed slave who owned almost nothing and taught thousands, a painter who could not stop asking questions, a scientist who stirred boiling ore in a leaking shed and refused to be turned away, a psychiatrist who lost everything in a camp and rebuilt a philosophy of meaning from the ruins, a man who taught himself to read in secret and used that knowledge to dismantle a system, an inventor who worked for a future he would not live to fully see, a woman who walked back into darkness 19 times to bring others into the light, a novelist who stood in front of a firing squad and then went on to write some of the most searching books in the history of literature. What connects them is not genius in the way we usually use that word, not some quality of mind that ordinary people lack. What connects them is a refusal to let the conditions of their lives be the final word about what their lives could mean. Each of them faced something that could have stopped them: empire, slavery, exclusion, imprisonment, loss, poverty, illness, ridicule. And each of them, in their own way, found something inside themselves that the outside world could not reach. That is what these 100 lessons are about. Not the achievements, the paintings, the books, the prizes, the discoveries, but the orientation behind those achievements. The decision made quietly and repeatedly to continue, to stay curious, to stay honest, to stay present to other people's suffering, to keep asking what is actually within your control and to release, gently, everything that is not. There are 90 more voices waiting. Let them come slowly, one at a time, as the night deepens and the day releases its hold on you. You are not being asked to become any of these people. You are only being invited to sit with what they found and to notice whether any of it is already, quietly, yours. This is explored during sleeping. Lesson 11, Seneca. Time is the only wealth that cannot be recovered. Lucius Annerius Seneca was one of the wealthiest men in Rome, advisor to an emperor, and author of letters about the importance of not caring too much about wealth. The contradiction was not lost on him. He addressed it directly, with the kind of dry self-awareness that makes him feel more modern than almost any writer of antiquity. He knew what he was, he knew what he preached, and he kept preaching it anyway, because he believed the truth of an idea was independent of whether the person speaking it had fully lived up to it. What Seneca returned to more than any other subject, more than virtue, more than friendship, more than the fear of death, was time. He was obsessed with it in the way that only someone who has felt it slipping can be. He wrote his great essay on the shortness of life not as an abstract philosophical exercise, but as an urgent, almost desperate argument. Life is not short, he said. We make it short. We give it away in chunks, to ambition, to distraction, to the opinions of people we do not even like, to the postponement of everything that actually matters. We say we will live later. Later never arrives in the form we imagined. He was exiled twice, came close to execution under Caligula, and was eventually ordered to take his own life by Nero, the emperor he had spent years trying to moderate and educate. He died with extraordinary composure, dictating thoughts to scribes while the process was underway, his mind still working, still examining, still trying to understand what it meant to face the end without flinching. His death was, by all accounts, more dignified than his life had always been. He had spent decades in compromise. He met the final moment cleanly. He wrote, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a great deal of it." He was not speaking about productivity in the modern sense, not about efficiency or optimization. He was speaking about presence, about the difference between time that passes through you and time that you actually inhabit, between a life that accumulates years and a life that accumulates depth. Tonight, let the hours behind you rest without judgment, and let the hours ahead, starting with this one, this quiet one, be genuinely yours. Seneca would say that is already a beginning. Lesson 12, Ada Lovelace. Imagination is the bridge between mathematics and poetry. Ada Lovelace was the daughter of Lord Byron and grew up in deliberate opposition to everything her father represented. Her mother, terrified that Ada would inherit Byron's volatile romanticism, arranged for her education to be rigorously mathematical, a calculated antidote to poetry. The plan did not work in the way her mother intended. Ada became deeply mathematical, yes. But she also became someone who believed, with complete conviction, that mathematics and imagination were not opposites. They were the same faculty, operating in different registers. She was introduced to Charles Babbage when she was 17, at a dinner party where he described his plans for a mechanical calculating engine. Most people heard the description and nodded politely. Ada heard it and understood it, not just the mechanics, but the implications. She began corresponding with Babbage, asking questions that went further than his own thinking, pushing on the boundaries of what such a machine might eventually be capable of. When she was in her mid-20s, she translated an Italian article about Babbage's analytical engine and added her own notes. Her notes were 3 times longer than the original article. Within those notes, she described something that no one else had yet articulated: the possibility that such a machine could be programmed to perform not just arithmetic, but any operation that could be expressed in symbolic form, including, she suggested, the composition of music. She wrote the first algorithm ever designed to be processed by a machine. She is, depending on how you draw the lines, the world's first computer programmer, a title she held more than a century before the first computer was built. She died at 36 of cancer, having spent much of her adult life in poor health. The bulk of her notes were not properly understood for decades. When they were rediscovered in the 20th century, as actual computers came into existence, what she had written stood up. Her imagination had arrived at the destination before the vehicle existed to make the journey. She wrote, "The analytical engine weaves algebraic patterns, just as the jacquard loom weaves flowers and leaves." In that sentence is the entire shape of her mind, the refusal to see beauty and logic as separate things, the insistence that the most rigorous thinking and the most lyrical thinking were, at their root, the same reaching toward pattern. Tonight, whatever you create, in whatever form, let her remind you that precision and imagination are not in competition. The greatest work has always needed both. Lesson 13, Abraham Lincoln, Humility Before History Makes a Leader. Abraham Lincoln grew up in a one-room log cabin in Kentucky, educated himself by firelight with borrowed books, failed at business twice, lost elections, suffered a breakdown severe enough that his friends removed sharp objects from his room, and spent years in obscurity wondering whether his life would amount to anything. He was not by any conventional measure a likely candidate for greatness. He was awkward, melancholy, self-deprecating almost to a fault. He told stories at moments when dignity seemed to call for silence. He doubted himself constantly and said so. He was elected President of the United States in 1860, and within months the country had split in two. The war that followed killed more Americans than any other in the nation's history, more than 600,000 dead by the most conservative estimates. Lincoln made decisions under pressure that had no precedent, with advisors who disagreed violently with each other and with him, in a country that was consuming itself. He was mocked in the press, despised by a significant portion of the population on both sides of the conflict, and lived under the constant awareness that history would judge not just his choices, but the civilization he was trying to hold together. What made him remarkable was not that he was certain. He was rarely certain. What made him remarkable was his capacity to sit with uncertainty, to hold contradictory pressures in his mind without resolving them prematurely, to change his position when the evidence changed, to admit he had been wrong. He revised the purpose of the war publicly and dramatically, moving it from the preservation of the Union to the abolition of slavery, not as a political maneuver, but as a moral reckoning. The Emancipation Proclamation was not popular when it was issued. He issued it anyway. He said, "I am a slow walker, but I never walk back." There is in that sentence a whole philosophy of leadership, not the lightning strike of brilliance, but the steady, irreversible accumulation of direction, not speed but commitment, not the absence of doubt, but the refusal to let doubt become paralysis. Tonight, if you are moving slowly towards something, if progress feels invisible or the distance still feels enormous, let Lincoln's long, deliberate walk be a companion. He never walked back. Neither do you have to. Lesson 14, Simone Weil. Attention is the rarest form of generosity. Simone Weil was a French philosopher who worked factory floors, picked grapes in harvest fields, fought briefly in the Spanish Civil War, and eventually ate so little in solidarity with the people of occupied France that her body could not sustain itself. She died at 34, of tuberculosis compounded by malnutrition, leaving behind a body of writing that her contemporaries mostly ignored and that subsequent generations have found inexhaustible. She was brilliant in the way that makes other brilliant people uncomfortable, not because she was combative, but because she was absolutely serious. She refused to soften her conclusions to make them more palatable. She refused to join institutions that would have given her work more reach, but compromised her ability to think freely, including, in the final years of her life, the Catholic Church, toward which she felt enormous spiritual pull, but which she declined to formally enter because she believed the act of belonging would dull the quality of her questioning. She remained at the threshold, permanently, and wrote some of the most searching theological essays of the 20th century from that position of deliberate outsideness. Her central idea, the one she returned to from every angle in every essay, was attention. Genuine attention, not concentration in the sense of effortful focus, but a quality of openness, of receiving what is actually there rather than what you expect or want to find. She believed this quality, which she called waiting on God in her theological writing and just attention in her more secular work, was the rarest and most generous thing one human being could offer another. To really attend to someone is to temporarily suspend your own needs, your own interpretations, your own urgency, and simply be present to what they are. She wrote, "Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity." She meant it completely. In a world that moves quickly, that fills every silence with noise, that interprets attention as agreement and misreads it as passivity, the willingness to genuinely stop and receive another person is an act of profound giving. It costs nothing material, it costs everything else. Tonight, as the noise of the day quiets, practice the thing she described. Not effort, not striving, just a gentle, open receiving of whatever is here. That, she would say, is already a form of love. Lesson 15, Charles Darwin, Patience reveals what haste cannot see. Charles Darwin sailed on the Beagle for 5 years, observing. He returned to England and spent the next 22 years not publishing his theory of evolution, observing more, collecting more, testing more, waiting. He was aware of what he had. He understood with some precision how large a claim it was. He also understood that a claim of that size needed to be unassailable before it could be made publicly. He was not timid. He was patient, which is a different thing entirely. He had arrived at the core of his theory relatively early in the process, the mechanism of natural selection, the gradual divergence of species through differential reproduction over enormous stretches of time. He had the outline. What he spent decades building was the evidence, the barnacle studies. The correspondence with breeders and naturalists around the world, the meticulous documentation of variation in domestic animals, the geological observations. He was building a case that could survive scrutiny from every direction, and he knew the scrutiny would be intense. When On the Origin of Species was finally published in 1859, it sold out on the first day. The reaction was everything he had anticipated: wonder, outrage, dismissal, revision, gradual absorption. He continued working. He wrote 10 more books after The Origin, on topics ranging from the formation of coral reefs to the expression of emotions in animals to the behavior of earthworms, which he studied for 40 years and considered one of the most important organisms in the ecology of soil. He said that the earthworm was more important to English agriculture than any invention of the Industrial Revolution. He was probably right. He wrote, "A man who dares to waste 1 hour of time has not discovered the value of life." Coming from someone who spent 22 years preparing a single publication, this is not a statement about urgency. It is a statement about presence, about the difference between time that serves the work and time that is simply consumed. Every hour of his waiting was working. He never wasted it. He used it to look more closely. Tonight, if you are in a period of preparation, a period that feels slow, that feels like nothing is happening, consider that it may be the most important part of what you are building. What you see when you slow down is what haste will always miss. Lesson 16, Rumi, the wound is where the light enters. Jalal ad-Din Rumi was a 13th century Persian poet and theologian living in Konya, in what is now Turkey, when a wandering mystic named Shams of Tabriz walked into his life and transformed it completely. Rumi was already established, a respected scholar, a teacher with hundreds of students, a man of considerable reputation. Shams was ragged, itinerant, difficult, and spoke about spiritual experience with a directness that made most people uncomfortable. Rumi recognized in him something that cracked him open. The two became inseparable, to the displeasure of Rumi's students and family, who eventually drove Shams away and possibly, according to some accounts, had him killed. The loss was devastating. Rumi entered a period of grief so intense that it transformed his entire mode of expression. He had written formal theological prose. Now he began to write poetry, ecstatic, intimate, searching poetry, spinning it out in enormous quantities, naming the great collection after the man he had lost, as if the writing itself were a form of continued conversation with someone who was no longer there to answer. The Masnavi, his masterwork, runs to more than 25,000 verses. It was composed over more than a decade, dictated to a devoted student named Hillesum, who would prompt Rumi to continue whenever he fell silent. It is not a structured argument. It is a river, stories flowing into digressions, flowing into parables, flowing into direct address, circling always around the same burning questions. What is the self? What is the divine? What is love in its most elemental form, stripped of all the comfortable meanings the word usually carries? Rumi understood grief not as an obstacle to spiritual life, but as its very engine. The reed flute, in his most famous opening passage, cries because it has been cut from the reed bed, separated from its origin. That separation is what makes it capable of music. The wound is not incidental. The wound is what allows the breath to pass through and become something that can reach other people. He is often quoted, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." Whether this precise phrasing is his or a later translator's compression of his idea, the thought is undeniably his. He lived it. He lost the person who had opened him most completely, and he responded by becoming more open, not less. By writing more, giving more, teaching more. The loss did not close him. It was, in the end, the making of him. Tonight, whatever has broken open in you, whatever grief or loss or rupture has left you feeling exposed, consider that it may not be damaged to be repaired. It may be the aperture through which something true is trying to reach you. Lesson 17, Florence Nightingale. Data and compassion are not opposites. Florence Nightingale is remembered as the woman with the lamp, moving through hospital wards at night, tending to wounded soldiers in the Crimea, a figure of tender devotion. The image is not wrong, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. What Nightingale actually brought to the hospitals of Scutari was not primarily comfort, it was systems. She arrived to find men dying not from their wounds but from cholera, dysentery and infections caused by contaminated water, inadequate ventilation, and the absence of basic sanitation. She did not accept this as the inevitable cost of war. She began to count. She was a gifted mathematician who had been educated against significant social resistance in statistics and data analysis. In the filthy, overcrowded wards of Scutari, she began keeping meticulous records: causes of death, timing of death, conditions in each ward, the relationship between environmental changes and mortality rates. When the army improved drainage and ventilation, the death rate dropped dramatically. She recorded it. She had the numbers to prove what had caused it and what had fixed it. This was not nursing in the sentimental sense. It was epidemiology, practiced under battlefield conditions, by a woman who was not supposed to be doing any of it. She returned to England and spent the next decades, largely from her bed, due to a chronic illness she developed in the Crimea, redesigning the British military hospital system, reforming civilian hospitals, founding a nursing school, and writing detailed technical reports that changed how governments understood public health. She invented a form of data visualization, the polar area diagram, sometimes called the rose diagram, to make mortality statistics legible to politicians who would not read tables. She understood that truth without communication is inert. She found a way to make the numbers move people. She wrote, "I attribute my success to this. I never gave or took any excuse." The sentence sounds simple. It is not. It describes a complete refusal to let the gap between what is and what should be become normalized, to let suffering become acceptable because it is familiar, to let preventable death continue because change is difficult. She did not take excuses from the system. She did not give them to herself. Tonight, wherever you see something that should be better and has been told it cannot be, let her careful, relentless counting be a quiet encouragement. She changed the world with numbers and a lamp. The lamp was for the patients. The numbers were for everyone else. Lesson 18, Lao Tzu. The softest thing in the world overcomes the hardest. Almost nothing certain is known about Lao Tzu. Not his name, not his dates, not whether he was a single person or a composite figure whose ideas accumulated over generations. The name itself means simply old master. Tradition places him in the 6th century BCE, a contemporary of Confucius, serving as a keeper of archives in the Zhou court before disappearing westward through a mountain pass, leaving behind, at the request of a border official who recognized him, a short text of about 5,000 characters. That text is the Tao Te Ching, and it is one of the most translated books in human history. The Tao Te Ching does not argue, it observes. It watches the way water moves, always seeking the lowest place, yielding to every obstacle, and yet wearing away the hardest stone over time. It watches the way a valley receives whatever flows into it and never fills. It watches the way the spokes of a wheel converge on an empty hub, and notes that it is the emptiness that makes the wheel useful. The book is a sustained meditation on the power of what seems weak, the usefulness of what seems empty, the strength of what refuses to compete. The Taoism that flows from this text is not a passive philosophy in the sense of indifference. It is a profound attentiveness to the natural movement of things, and an argument that the person who aligns with that movement, rather than forcing against it, will accomplish more with less effort, sustain more without burning out, and remain more fully themselves under pressure. The Chinese concept of Wu Wei, often translated as non-action or effortless action, does not mean doing nothing. It means not forcing, not straining against the grain of what is, finding the path of least resistance not out of laziness, but out of deep attention to how things actually work. The text says, in one of its most enduring passages, the softest thing in the world overcomes the hardest thing in the world. Water over stone, patience over force, presence over aggression. This is not a comfortable teaching for a culture built on the idea that harder effort always produces better results. It is, however, an observation about nature that 25 centuries of human experience have done nothing to disprove. Tonight, if you have been pushing hard against something that will not move, let this ancient voice suggest a different question. Not, how do I push harder, but where is the natural opening? Where does the water want to go? Lesson 19, Galileo Galilei, truth does not require permission. Galileo Galilei was 68 years old when he was brought before the Inquisition in Rome and made to kneel and recant. He had spent years arguing with evidence that the Earth moved around the Sun, that the Copernican model was not a mathematical convenience but a physical description of reality. The Church had decided otherwise. Under threat of torture, he recanted. The legend says that as he rose from his knees he muttered under his breath, and yet it moves. The story is almost certainly apocryphal. It does not matter, it captures something true about his life. He had been building toward this confrontation for decades. His improvements to the telescope, which he did not invent but refined into a tool powerful enough for serious astronomical observation, had allowed him to see things no human being had seen before. The moons of Jupiter, orbiting their planet and not the Earth, proved that not everything in the sky revolved around us. The phases of Venus demonstrated that Venus orbited the Sun. The surface of the moon was rough and cratered, not the perfect crystalline sphere that philosophical tradition had insisted it must be. Evidence accumulated. The universe was not what the authorized version said it was. He was a gifted writer who understood that science needed an audience. He wrote in Italian rather than Latin, the language of scholars, so that educated people outside the university system could read and follow his arguments. He used dialogue and humor and narrative. He wanted the evidence to be available to anyone willing to look, not locked behind the walls of academic Latin. This was itself a kind of defiance, the insistence that truth belonged to everyone, not to the institution's license to interpret it. The Inquisition could silence him. It could not change what was true. He was placed under house arrest for the remaining 9 years of his life and continued working, completing his most important work on the physics of motion during that period of enforced stillness. The truth he had seen did not require his freedom to remain true. He wrote, "All truths are easy to understand once they are discovered. The point is to discover them. The discovery requires courage, the willingness to look at what is actually there, rather than what you have been told to see, and to hold to what you find even when the cost of holding is high." Tonight, if there is something you know to be true that the world around you is not ready to confirm, let Galileo's long, stubborn patience be a companion. The evidence does not require permission to be real. Lesson 20, a reflection on the second arc of voices. 20 minds have spoken now, and the night has grown quieter around their words. We began with emperors and slaves, with painters who could not stop asking questions and scientists who stirred the earth itself to find what was hidden inside it. We have moved through grief and poetry, through data collected in dying wards, through the softest thing overcoming the hardest, through a man kneeling before authority and knowing, even as he bent, that the stars would not rearrange themselves to suit the verdict. What these 20 lives share is not triumph in any simple sense. Marcus Aurelius never stopped being tested. Epictetus never stopped being a body that had been broken by someone else's hand. Ada Lovelace died before the machine she imagined was built. Harriet Tubman walked back into darkness 19 times because the alternative, staying safe while others remained enslaved, was not something she could live with. Galileo spent his final years under house arrest, still working, in a room the world had locked around him. What they share is something quieter and more durable than triumph, a quality of orientation, a refusal to let what could not be controlled determine what was possible inside, an understanding, arrived at through vastly different lives, in vastly different centuries and languages and circumstances, that the most important work always happens in the interior, and that the interior, no matter what the exterior does to it, retains a freedom that cannot finally be revoked. There are 80 more voices ahead. They will come from different corners of the world, different disciplines, different kinds of suffering and different kinds of discovery. Some will be famous, some will be less known than they deserve. All of them found something worth passing on, not as instruction but as witness. Here is what I saw, here is what I learned. Here is what I am giving you, across the distance of years, in the hope that it reaches you at the moment you most need it. Let the night deepen now. Let these 20 voices settle into the quiet. You do not need to carry them, they will carry themselves. This is explored during sleeping. Lesson 21, Socrates. The unexamined life is not worth living. Socrates never wrote a single word. Everything we know about him comes through the accounts of others, primarily his student Plato, who may have put his own ideas into his teacher's mouth so frequently that separating the historical Socrates from the Platonic Socrates has occupied scholars for 2.5 millennia. What is beyond reasonable dispute is that Socrates walked the streets and marketplaces of Athens asking questions, relentless, uncomfortable, apparently simple questions that had a way of revealing that the person being questioned did not actually know what they thought they knew. He called this the examined life, and he considered it the only life worth living. He was not popular with everyone. The questions had a way of humiliating people who considered themselves wise. He attracted devoted young followers, which made their fathers nervous. He was accused of corrupting the youth of Athens and of impiety toward the gods, charges that were, at least in part, politically motivated, the result of his association with figures on the losing side of recent Athenian political struggles. He was put on trial at the age of 70 and given the opportunity to propose an alternative to the death penalty. He refused to propose anything that would involve him ceasing to philosophize. He was sentenced to death by hemlock. He met the sentence with equanimity that his friends found almost unbearable. On the day of the execution, while his companions wept, he continued to talk about the soul, about what might lie beyond death, about whether philosophers should fear the end of a life spent preparing for exactly this kind of letting go. He drank the hemlock. He died asking questions. What he left behind was not a system of answers. It was a method, the Socratic method of questioning, of following an argument wherever it leads regardless of how uncomfortable the destination, of treating every assumption as provisional until it has been examined. He believed that most human misery arose from people acting on beliefs they had never genuinely tested, from lives lived on the surface of themselves, from the refusal to look closely at what they actually valued and why. He said the unexamined life is not worth living. He did not say the examined life is easy or comfortable or rewarded. He said it is the only one that fully earns the name. Tonight, let one question rest with you, not to be answered, but to be held. What do you believe, and have you ever looked at it closely enough to know why? Lesson 22, Hypatia of Alexandria. Knowledge belongs to everyone who seeks it. Hypatia of Alexandria was a mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher who taught in the great city of Alexandria in the late 4th and early 5th centuries CE. She was the daughter of the mathematician Theon, who educated her with extraordinary rigor, and she went on to surpass him, editing and commenting on major mathematical texts, developing her own instruments for astronomical observation, and attracting students from across the Mediterranean world who came specifically to study with her. She was, by all contemporary accounts, the most accomplished mathematician in Alexandria. She was also a woman, a pagan, and a teacher of open inquiry in a city that was increasingly fractured along religious and political lines. She taught students of every background, Christian, pagan, wealthy, of more modest means, and she taught them in the tradition of the ancient schools, philosophy as a way of life, not merely a subject of study. She corresponded with civic leaders and advised governors. She was, in the deepest sense, a public intellectual, someone whose knowledge was not hoarded, but shared as widely as possible, as freely as possible, in the conviction that understanding was not the property of any particular group. In 415 CE, she was killed by a Christian mob, pulled from her carriage, dragged into a church and murdered. The reasons were partly theological, partly political, partly the result of a power struggle between the city's bishop and its governor, in which she had become entangled by virtue of her relationships with civic leadership. She was a convenient target in a city where violence had become a language of persuasion. Her death marked, in the estimation of many historians, the effective end of the Alexandrian philosophical tradition. What she represents is not merely a tragedy, but a principle, the principle that knowledge is not a private possession, that inquiry belongs to everyone who approaches it with honesty, and that the attempt to restrict the free movement of ideas has always required force, because ideas do not yield willingly to authority. She gave her life, not by choice but by circumstance, to the proposition that a teacher's obligation is to the truth of what she teaches, and to the students willing to receive it. She left behind no texts of her own that survive, only the record of what others said about her and what she edited and preserved. Tonight, let her lost voice be a reminder of what is still at stake in every generation, the question of whether knowledge will be kept open or closed, shared or hoarded, and who bears the cost when the answer goes wrong. Lesson 23, Isaac Newton, Stand on the Shoulders of Giants. Isaac Newton did much of the work that would define his legacy during a period of roughly 18 months between 1665 and 1667, when Cambridge University was closed due to plague, and he retreated to his family home in Woolsthorpe. He was in his early 20s. In that period of enforced isolation, with nothing to do but think, he developed the foundations of calculus, made fundamental discoveries about the nature of light and color, and began the gravitational investigations that would eventually become the Principia Mathematica. He did not publish any of it for years. When he finally did, it changed the shape of human knowledge permanently. He was not an easy person. He was secretive, deeply suspicious of being scooped, prone to bitter priority disputes, most famously with Leibniz over the invention of calculus, a quarrel that poisoned European mathematics for a generation. He spent enormous amounts of time on alchemy and on biblical chronology, pursuits that his later admirers found embarrassing and tended to suppress. He was intensely religious in ways that did not sit comfortably with his scientific reputation. He was, in short, a complete human being rather than the marble monument that posterity preferred. What made him singular was not merely the power of his mind, though that power was extraordinary, but the depth of his engagement with what had come before him. He read voraciously, absorbed the work of Kepler and Galileo and Descartes and dozens of others, argued with them in the margins of his books, and built from their foundations something that none of them had been able to reach. He understood that no mind, however gifted, works from nothing. Every insight stands on the accumulated labor of everyone who looked carefully at the world before you. He wrote in a letter to his rival Robert Hooke, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." The sentence is often quoted as a statement of humility. It is also a statement of methodology, a recognition that intellectual inheritance is not a burden but a gift, that the proper response to what has been given to you is not to pretend you invented it, but to carry it forward as far as you can. Tonight, think of the people whose thinking has shaped yours, the teachers, the writers, the quiet influences you may not have named in years. You are standing on shoulders too. What are you building from there? Lesson 24, Harriet Beecher Stowe. A single story can change the world. Harriet Beecher Stowe was a minister's daughter, a mother of 7 children, a woman living in Cincinnati across the river from Kentucky, close enough to slavery to see it, to know people who had escaped it, to understand in the most immediate terms what the institution meant in the lives of actual human beings. She was not a politician, not a military figure, not an economist or a philosopher. She was a writer. And in 1851, when she was in her late 30s, she began publishing in serial form a novel about the lives of enslaved people in the American South. Uncle Tom's Cabin appeared in full in 1852 and sold 300,000 copies in its first year in the United States and over 1 million in Britain within months. It was the best-selling novel of the 19th century. It was also, in ways that are difficult to measure precisely but impossible to dismiss, one of the most politically consequential works of fiction in American history. It made the human reality of slavery legible to an enormous audience that had been able to maintain an emotional distance from the institution as a legal and economic abstraction. It gave faces and voices and interior lives to people who had been rendered invisible by the very system that profited from them. When Abraham Lincoln met her during the Civil War, he reportedly said, and the quote may be apocryphal but the sentiment was real, "So you are the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." Whatever Lincoln actually said, the observation captures something true, that the novel had done what political argument and economic analysis had not fully managed to do. It had made people feel the weight of what was happening, and feeling it, they could no longer ignore it in the same way. She wrote from her kitchen table, between the demands of her household and her family. She said that the book had been given to her, that she had been the instrument rather than the author, that the scenes had come to her with a force she did not feel she could take credit for. Whatever the source, the result was a document that moved through the world and moved the world. Tonight, let her remind you that the stories we tell, even the ones that begin at a kitchen table, even the ones that no one asked for, carry more power than we know how to measure. One true story, told with full attention to the human reality inside it, can reach places that nothing else can. Lesson 25, Blaise Pascal. The heart has reasons that reason does not know. Blaise Pascal was a child prodigy who had independently rediscovered Euclidean geometry by the age of 12, without access to the texts, by working it out from first principles on a floor with chalk. By 16, he had written a significant work on conic sections. By 18, he had designed and built one of the first mechanical calculators, a machine to help his father, a tax official, with the burden of arithmetic. By his early 20s, he had conducted the experiments that established the existence of atmospheric pressure and the nature of the vacuum. He was, in the estimation of many who came after him, one of the most naturally gifted scientific minds of the 17th century. Then, on a night in November 1654, he had an experience of overwhelming religious intensity, an experience he recorded immediately afterward in a document he sewed into the lining of his coat and kept against his body for the rest of his life. The document begins with the single word fire. He turned away from most of his scientific work and spent the remaining years of his life writing and thinking about faith, reason, and the condition of the human being caught between them. He died at 39. The notes he left behind were assembled posthumously into the work known as the Pensées, one of the strangest and most searching documents in the history of philosophy. Pascal understood, more clearly than almost anyone before him, the limits of reason not as an argument against reason, but as an honest account of its boundaries. He saw that human beings are not primarily rational creatures who occasionally feel things. They are creatures of habit, imagination, fear, desire, and love who are also, sometimes, capable of reason. The heart, by which he meant the whole interior life, not merely emotion, perceives truths that the logical mind cannot reach and cannot, afterward, fully justify. He wrote, "The heart has its reasons, which reason does not know." He was not arguing for irrationality. He was arguing for completeness, for an honest account of how human beings actually arrive at the things they most deeply believe, and for the humility to acknowledge that the most important things we know are not, finally, the products of argument. Tonight, let whatever you feel most deeply, without needing to justify it, without needing to prove it, simply be present. Pascal would say it knows something. He would say to trust it with great care. Lesson 26, Rosa Parks. Dignity is not given, it is claimed. Rosa Parks did not refuse to give up her seat on a Montgomery, Alabama bus on the 1st of December 1955 because she was tired. She said so herself repeatedly for the rest of her long life. She was not physically tired. She was not too weary to move. She was tired of giving in. The distinction matters. One is a bodily condition. The other is a decision, a moral decision, made in a specific moment, on behalf of something that had been building for a very long time. She was not, as the sanitized version of the story sometimes suggests, a simple seamstress who spontaneously broke a rule without fully understanding the consequences. She was a trained activist who had attended the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, a center for civil rights organizing, and who had been investigating racial violence and injustice in Alabama for years as secretary of the NAACP chapter in Montgomery. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was calm because she had thought about this, because she had looked at what she was willing to risk, and because she had decided that her dignity, and the dignity of every person who had ever been forced to move for no reason other than the color of their skin, was worth the cost. She was arrested. She was convicted of violating segregation laws. Her case became the catalyst for the Montgomery bus boycott, 381 days during which the black community of Montgomery refused to ride the city's buses, walking miles to work in the Alabama heat, organizing carpools, sustaining a collective act of economic resistance that ultimately led to the Supreme Court ruling that bus segregation was unconstitutional. It was one of the pivotal moments of the American civil rights movement, and it began with one woman deciding that she would not move. She said, "I have learned over the years that when one's mind is made up, this diminishes fear. The clarity she is describing is not the absence of danger. The danger was real. It is the condition that comes when you have decided, at a level deeper than fear, what you will and will not do. When that decision is made, the fear does not disappear, but it no longer governs." Tonight, let her stillness on that bus reach you across the years. There are moments when the most powerful thing a person can do is simply refuse to move. She showed us what that looks like. Lesson 27, Confucius. The superior person begins with themselves. Confucius spent most of his adult life in failure by the measures he cared most about. He believed that society could be reformed, that corruption, violence, and the deterioration of civic virtue could be reversed, if rulers would simply return to the ancient principles of right relationship, between ruler and subject, parent and child, husband and wife, elder sibling and younger, friend and friend. He spent decades traveling between the states of ancient China, seeking a ruler willing to implement these principles. None of them ultimately were. He died in 479 BCE at around 70 years old, having never held the political position he believed would allow him to do the most good. He had, however, taught hundreds of students, and through them, he would shape Chinese civilization for the next 2.5 millennia. What Confucius taught was not a religion in the Western sense, not a metaphysical system, not an account of the cosmos. It was an ethics of relationship, a precise, demanding account of what people owe to one another and how those obligations, fulfilled with genuine attention and care, produce a society in which human beings can flourish. At the center of this ethics was the concept of ren, often translated as benevolence or humaneness or loving others, a quality that could not be performed but had to be cultivated over years through practice and self-examination and the disciplined effort to treat others as one wished to be treated. The work of cultivation, Confucius insisted, began not with the reform of society, but with the reform of oneself. You cannot bring order to the state if there is no order in your household. You cannot bring order to your household if there is no order in yourself. And there is no order in yourself if you have not examined your own character with honesty and and committed to the daily work of becoming more fully what a human being is capable of being. The superior person, the Junzi, which he used not as a term of birth but of character, is always turning inward first. He said, "To know what you know and what you do not know, that is true knowledge." The sentence is a whole method in 9 words, not the performance of confidence, but the honest mapping of the territory of one's own understanding. Knowing where your knowledge ends is the beginning of wisdom. It is also, he believed, the beginning of genuine relationship, because you cannot truly attend to another person while pretending to know things you do not. Tonight, let his long, patient, ultimately world-shaping failure be a comfort. The work he believed in most, the quiet, daily work of becoming, outlasted every political disappointment. It still does. Lesson 28, Mary Wollstonecraft. The argument for equality never finishes itself. Mary Wollstonecraft wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Woman in 1792, in 6 weeks, in a state of what she described as sustained fury. She had been reading the new revolutionary documents coming out of France and noticed, with a clarity that apparently no one else was rushing to articulate, that the universal rights being proclaimed so passionately did not seem to include half the human species. She sat down and wrote the argument that should have been obvious, that women were not naturally inferior, not naturally incapable of reason, not naturally suited only to domestic life, but had been made to appear so by an education system that deliberately denied them the development of their rational faculties, and then pointed to the result as proof of their limitations. She was 33 years old. She had already lived a life of significant difficulty, poverty, an alcoholic father, work as a governess, and a companion that she found suffocating, the founding of a school that failed, years of writing for subsistence. She was not writing from a position of comfort or security. She was writing because she could see something clearly and believed that seeing it clearly obligated her to say it, regardless of the reception. The reception was mixed. She was praised in some quarters and savaged in others. After her death, she died at 38 from complications following childbirth. Her husband published a memoir that disclosed details of her unconventional life, including an illegitimate child and a suicide attempt. The disclosure was meant lovingly, but was used by her critics to discredit her work. For decades, her reputation suffered from the association between her arguments and her private biography, as if the validity of the claim that women deserved equal education depended on the personal virtue of the woman making it. She wrote, "I do not wish women to have power over men, but over themselves." The sentence is precise in the way that only sentences written in fury can be. It cuts directly to what was being withheld and what was being asked for. Not dominance, not reversal, simply the condition of being the author of one's own life. Tonight, let her unfinished argument, still unfinished, still being made, rest in the room with you. The things she saw clearly in 1792 took 2 more centuries to begin becoming policy and are still contested. Truth, she would say, does not expire. It waits. Lesson 29, Albert Einstein. Imagination is more important than knowledge. Albert Einstein failed his entrance examination to the Swiss Federal Polytechnic School on his first attempt. He was eventually admitted, graduated, and then could not find an academic position. He applied repeatedly and was rejected, finally taking a job as a patent clerk in Bern, a position his former professors considered beneath his abilities. He spent 7 years reviewing patent applications. In his spare time in 1905, a year he later called his annus mirabilis, his miraculous year, he published 4 papers that each, individually, would have established a major scientific reputation. Together, they changed physics permanently. The special theory of relativity, the photoelectric effect, for which he would eventually receive the Nobel Prize, the explanation of Brownian motion, the equivalence of mass and energy, expressed in what became the most famous equation in history. He was 26 years old. He was working without access to a university library, in a patent office, in a country that was not his own. The work came from his imagination, from his habit, developed in childhood, of constructing detailed mental pictures of physical situations, and then reasoning through them with the full weight of mathematical precision. He was a thought experimenter. He asked, what would it look like to ride alongside a beam of light? What would you see? He held the question for 10 years before the mathematics fell into place. The imagination came first, the formalism followed. He believed this was true not just for him, but for anyone genuinely engaged with a hard problem, that the ability to picture things, to hold a question in the mind without forcing a premature answer, was the faculty that made the difference between information and understanding. He said, imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited. Imagination encircles the world. He was not diminishing knowledge. He was locating it correctly as the raw material that imagination needs in order to build something new. Without knowledge, imagination has nothing to work with. But without imagination, knowledge simply accumulates inert without going anywhere. Tonight, let the questions you have been carrying, the ones that do not yet have answers, rest in your imagination rather than your anxiety. Einstein would say they are already working. Let them. Lesson 30, a reflection on the third arc. 30 voices now, and the night has grown deeper around them. In this third arc, we have heard from a man who never wrote a word and died for his questions. A woman who taught mathematics in a city that would eventually kill her for it. A mind that rebuilt the laws of motion in a plague-enforced solitude. A writer at a kitchen table whose novel altered the course of a nation. A mathematician who sewed his most important insight into the lining of his coat. A woman who did not move on a bus in Alabama and changed everything by staying still. An ancient teacher who spent a lifetime failing at politics and succeeded at civilization. A writer in a fury who made an argument that is still being finished. A patent clerk who reimagined the universe in his lunch hour. Each of them was working in their own way with the same materials, the conditions they had been given, the capacities they had developed, and the questions they could not stop asking. None of them had permission. None of them waited for the world to tell them they were ready. They began with what they had where they were, and trusted that the work itself would teach them what they still needed to know. There is something in that trust, quiet, patient, unsentimental, that does not age. The world has changed enormously since Socrates walked the Athenian marketplace asking impertinent questions. The instruments have changed, the institutions have changed, the languages have changed. But the posture has not. The posture of a person who takes their questions seriously, who refuses to let fear or convention or the opinion of others determine the boundary of what is possible, who keeps working in the available light. You are 30 lessons in, 70 more remain. Let them come slowly, one at a time, as the night holds you and the day grows more distant. There is no hurry here. The voices have been waiting centuries. They will wait as long as you need. This is explored during sleeping. Lesson 31, Aristotle. Excellence is a habit, not an act. Aristotle arrived in Athens at 17 to study at Plato's academy and stayed for 20 years, first as a student, then as a teacher, remaining until Plato's death. He was not, by all accounts, Plato's most obedient disciple. He argued with his teacher, developed his own positions, and eventually departed so thoroughly from Platonic philosophy that the two systems are considered opposing poles of Western thought. Plato reaching upward toward ideal forms existing beyond the material world, Aristotle bending downward toward the particular, the observable, the thing that can be touched and measured and classified. He wanted to understand the world as it actually was, not as it ought to be in some perfect realm beyond experience. He founded his own school, the Lyceum, and over the course of his life produced an astonishing range of work on logic, physics, biology, metaphysics, ethics, politics, rhetoric, poetry, and the study of the heavens. His biological writings alone, based on direct observation of hundreds of species, were not surpassed for nearly 2,000 years. He was wrong about many things, about the role of the heart versus the brain, about the immobility of the earth, about the natural inferiority of certain groups of people, and his errors were influential for centuries precisely because his authority was so great. But his method, the insistence on looking carefully at what is actually there before building a theory to explain it, was one of the most important intellectual gifts ever given to the human species. On the question of how a person becomes good, he was precise in a way that still holds. Virtue, he argued, is not a feeling and not an insight, it is a practice. You do not become courageous by understanding courage in the abstract. You become courageous by doing courageous things repeatedly until the response becomes a settled disposition, until courage is not an effort but a character. The same is true of honesty, of generosity, of self-discipline, of justice. They are all habits before they are achievements. They are built in the daily repetition of small choices, most of which no one observes. He wrote, "We are what we repeatedly do." Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. The sentence, or rather, the paraphrase of his argument that has settled into this form over centuries, is one of the most practically useful ideas in the history of philosophy, not because it is comforting, but because it is true, and because it relocates the question from the grand to the ordinary. You do not become excellent in a single heroic moment. You become excellent in the 10,000 unremarkable moments that no one will ever remember or record. Tonight, let that quiet truth settle. Whatever you are trying to build in yourself, the building is already happening in how you spent today, in the small choices that felt too minor to count. They count, they are the whole of it. Lesson 32, Sojourner Truth. Speak from where you stand. Sojourner Truth was born Isabella Baumfree, enslaved in New York around 1797. and spent the first 30 years of her life in bondage, separated from her family, sold multiple times, subjected to labor and violence that she described later in plain, unsparing language. She escaped in 1826, a year before New York's emancipation law took effect, taking her infant daughter and walking away in the early morning hours. She did not run. She walked because, she said, she felt that God would help her and that walking was sufficient. She arrived at the home of a Quaker family named Van Wagenen, who sheltered her and paid her former owner a small sum to prevent pursuit. She renamed herself in 1843, after what she described as a divine calling, a voice telling her to travel and speak the truth. She became one of the most powerful voices of the abolitionist movement, and eventually of the early women's rights movement, speaking at conventions and churches and gatherings across the northeastern United States, with a force and directness that no prepared text could fully replicate, because she spoke entirely without notes, from the immediate authority of what she had lived. At the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio in 1851, she delivered the speech that would become her most famous, a response to male ministers in the audience who were arguing that women were too delicate and too intellectually limited for the rights being demanded. She stood up and described in precise and unadorned detail what her life had actually been: the field work, the beatings, the children sold away, the body that had done as much physical labor as any man's. She did not ask for their sympathy. She did not ask for their recognition. She asked them to look at what was in front of them and draw the obvious conclusion. She is most often quoted as saying, "Ain't I a woman?" a rhetorical question she apparently repeated several times in the speech, building it as a kind of refrain against each argument for women's weakness. The power of the question is in its simplicity. She did not construct a philosophical argument. She offered her own existence as the evidence. Here I am, look at me. Now tell me again what a woman cannot do. Tonight, let her directness reach you. You do not need credentials or permission to speak what you know from living it. Where you have stood is already a kind of authority. Lesson 33, Immanuel Kant. Act only according to principles you would want to be universal law. Immanuel Kant lived one of the most externally uneventful lives in the history of philosophy. He was born in Königsberg, Prussia, in 1724, spent his entire life there, never traveled more than a few miles from the city of his birth, rose at the same hour every morning, took the same walk at the same time every afternoon with such regularity that his neighbors reportedly set their clocks by him, and died in Königsberg in 1804 at the age of 79. Nothing dramatic happened to him in the outward sense. Inwardly, he produced a revolution. His three great critiques of pure reason, of practical reason, and of judgment restructured the foundations of Western philosophy. He asked with unprecedented rigor what the human mind could actually know, by what mechanism knowledge was possible at all, and what the limits of that mechanism were. He argued that the mind did not passively receive reality, but actively structured it, that space, time, and causation were not features of the world in itself, but forms that the mind imposed on experience in order to make it intelligible. This was not a small claim. It reoriented the entire conversation about knowledge, reality, and the relationship between the two. But it is his moral philosophy that has had the most enduring practical influence. He argued that morality could not be grounded in consequences, in feelings, in tradition, or in divine command. None of these were reliable enough, universal enough, to serve as the foundation of genuine ethical obligation. What was needed was a principle that applied to all rational beings at all times, regardless of circumstance. He called it the categorical imperative, and its most famous formulation is this: act only according to principles that you could at the same time will to become universal laws. Do not make exceptions for yourself that you would not grant to everyone else. Do not treat other people merely as means to your own ends, but always also as ends in themselves, as beings whose existence has a value that is not conditional on their usefulness to you. He wrote, "Two things fill the mind with ever-increasing wonder and awe, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. The pairing is deliberate. The vastness of the universe and the depth of moral obligation, he found them equally astonishing, equally beyond full comprehension, equally capable of producing in the careful observer something that could only be called reverence." Tonight, let his quiet, clockwork life be a small comfort. The most expansive thinking does not require the most dramatic existence. It requires only the daily willingness to look carefully and to hold what you find without flinching. Lesson 34, Nikola Tesla, already covered in Lesson 7. Replacing with Ibn Battuta, to travel is to know the world cannot be contained in one mind. Ibn Battuta left his home city of Tangier in Morocco in 1325, at the age of 21, intending to make the Hajj, the Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca. He completed it, and then he kept going. Over the next 29 years, he traveled approximately 75,000 miles across the Islamic world and beyond, through North Africa, the Middle East, the East African coast, Persia, Central Asia, India, Southeast Asia, and China. He served as a judge, an ambassador, and a diplomatic representative. He was shipwrecked, robbed, almost executed, and married several times in different countries. He witnessed the Black Death sweeping through the Middle East. He met rulers and scholars and merchants and mystics from dozens of cultures and recorded, in extraordinary detail, what he saw. His account, the Rihla, meaning simply the journey, was dictated to a scholar upon his return to Morocco and runs to hundreds of pages. It is one of the most comprehensive first-hand accounts of the medieval world ever produced, covering geography, culture, political structures, religious practice, food, architecture, and the character of individual rulers with an observational precision that historians still rely on for understanding regions and periods that left few other written records. He was not a trained scholar in the conventional sense. He was a traveler who paid attention. What made his account extraordinary was not just its scope, but its quality of genuine encounter. He did not travel to confirm what he already believed. He traveled and was surprised repeatedly, and he recorded the surprise alongside the observation. He found, in culture after culture, variations on human practices that he had assumed were universal, hospitality offered in forms he did not expect, justice administered through systems he had never imagined, beauty achieved through means entirely different from any he had known at home. The world, he discovered, was vastly larger and more various than any single tradition could contain. He wrote, reflecting on his journeys, "Traveling, it leaves you speechless, then turns you into a storyteller. The movement from speechlessness to story is the movement from encounter to understanding, from the moment when the world exceeds your categories to the moment when you find new words for what you have seen." He spent a lifetime in that transit. Tonight, let his vast, restless curiosity be a companion. You do not need to travel 75,000 miles to be opened by the world. The encounter that exceeds your categories can happen anywhere. The question is whether you are willing to let it. Lesson 35, Hannah Arendt. Thinking is the refusal to be carried away. Hannah Arendt fled Nazi Germany in 1933, was stateless for 18 years, was briefly interned in a French detention camp, escaped, and eventually reached the United States, where she became one of the most significant political philosophers of the 20th century. She had grown up in a Jewish family in Hanover, studied philosophy under Martin Heidegger, with whom she had a complicated personal relationship, and later under Karl Jaspers, who became her lifelong friend and intellectual companion. She had been educated in the highest traditions of German philosophical thought, and then the world those traditions were embedded in had tried to murder her people. This was not an abstraction for Arendt. It was a fact she spent the rest of her life trying to understand, not emotionally, not as a wound, but philosophically, with the full force of the analytical tools she had inherited. How had it happened? How had an entire civilization, educated, cultured, philosophically sophisticated, produced the machinery of genocide? What had gone wrong not just politically, but at the level of thought itself? Her answer developed across multiple major works, centered on what she called the banality of evil, a phrase she coined after attending the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961. Eichmann, who had been one of the key organizers of the deportation of Jews to the death camps, was not a monster in the psychological sense. He was a bureaucrat. He was ordinary. What had made him capable of participating in atrocity was not malice but thoughtlessness, the suspension of the individual moral judgment that makes a person ask, in any situation, what is actually happening here, and what is my responsibility in it? Thinking, for Arendt, was not an academic exercise. It was a moral act, the refusal to be swept along by the current of events, by ideology, by the pressure of group membership, by the comfort of not having to decide for yourself. The person who thinks, genuinely thinks, maintains a kind of interior independence that makes certain kinds of complicity impossible. The person who stops thinking is available to be used by any force powerful enough to provide the sense of purpose and belonging that independent thought requires you to supply for yourself. She wrote, "The sad truth is that most evil is done by people who never make up their minds to be good or evil." The sadness in that sentence is real. It is easier to imagine that evil requires a particular kind of person, a particular kind of intention. She found something more disturbing, that it requires mainly the absence of a particular kind of effort, the effort to think. Tonight, let her long, careful, courageous thinking be an invitation, not to solve everything, she didn't, but to keep asking, even when it's uncomfortable, even when the question has no clean answer. That asking is itself a kind of resistance. Lesson 36, Michelangelo. The sculpture already exists inside the stone. Michelangelo Buonarroti was quarrelsome, difficult, frequently unwashed, and by his own account deeply unhappy for most of his life. He fought with patrons, abandoned projects, was crushed by the weight of what he demanded of himself, and lived in a state of near-permanent spiritual anguish about the relationship between beauty and salvation, between the body he depicted so magnificently and the soul he believed was imprisoned in it. He was also, by the consensus of the centuries, one of the supreme artists who ever lived, the creator of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, the Pietà, the David, and thousands of other works that bend the category of what human hands are capable of producing. He began painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling in 1508 and completed it in 1512, working largely alone, lying on scaffolding in conditions of physical discomfort he described in a sardonic poem written to a friend. His neck strained, his face used as a floor by dripping paint, his brush always above him, his beard pointing toward heaven. He was a sculptor doing a painter's commission, on a surface he had not chosen, depicting a narrative program he had not designed, for a pope whose interruptions and urgings he resented. The result was one of the most astonishing achievements in the history of art. He was 37 when he finished it. What Michelangelo believed, in his most lyrical accounts of his own process, was that the sculptor did not impose a form on the stone, but revealed a form already latent within it. The David was already in the marble. The task was to remove everything that was not the David. This is not a technical description of how stone carving works. It is a description of how it feels, the sense that the thing being made is discovered rather than invented, that the artist's role is not creation from nothing, but a kind of attentive listening to what the material is already trying to say. He wrote, "The sculpture is already complete within the marble block before I start my work. It is already there, I just have to chisel away the superfluous material." Whether or not this is literally true as a description of his process, it is true as a description of a certain kind of creative experience, the experience of working in alignment with something rather than against it, of finding rather than forcing. Tonight, whatever you are working toward, whatever you are trying to become or build or uncover, let his image of the latent form rest with you. Perhaps it is already there. Perhaps the work is only the removal of what is covering it. Lesson 37, Wangari Maathai, plant a tree, change a continent. Wangari Maathai was the first woman in East and Central Africa to earn a doctorate, the first African woman to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, and the founder of the Green Belt Movement, an organization that, over the course of several decades, planted more than 50 million trees across Kenya and inspired similar movements across the continent. She began in 1977 with a simple observation and a simple act. The land was degrading, the rivers were drying, the women who walked miles for firewood and clean water were suffering most directly from the environmental collapse that colonial agricultural policies and post-independence governance had accelerated. She gave a group of women seedlings and asked them to plant trees. They did. The movement grew because it understood something that purely top-down conservation efforts often missed, that environmental degradation and human poverty and political disempowerment were not separate problems with separate solutions. They were the same problem, experienced from different angles, and the solution had to address all of them at once. The women who planted trees were not just planting trees. They were restoring their own agency, learning that the land could be healed, that they could heal it, that the choices of ordinary people working together in an ordinary place could produce extraordinary change over time. The Kenyan government under Daniel Arap Moi found her threatening enough to have her beaten, imprisoned, and publicly ridiculed. She was called irrational, a troublemaker, insufficiently feminine. She kept planting. She kept organizing. She won a seat in Parliament in 2002 and used it, among other things, to advocate for the forests that the government had been selling off to developers. She accepted the Nobel Prize in 2004 with a speech that connected environmental conservation to democracy, to human rights, and to the basic proposition that the earth is not a resource to be extracted, but a home to be tended. She said, "It's the little things citizens do, that's what will make the difference. My little thing is planting trees." The sentence is disarming in its modesty and radical in its implication. The scale of the problem, environmental destruction, political corruption, the grinding poverty of rural communities, is enormous. The act of planting a tree is small. She chose the small act anyway and repeated it 50 million times. Tonight, let her patient, rooted, unarguable work be a reminder. You do not have to solve everything. You have to do your little thing, then do it again tomorrow. Lesson 38, Blaise Pascal, already covered in Lesson 25. Replacing with Diogenes of Sinope, everything you do not need is already a form of freedom. Diogenes of Sinope was ancient Greece's most provocative philosopher and most deliberate eccentric. He was exiled from his home city, reportedly for defacing the currency, either literally or as a metaphor for his project of defacing the social currency of convention, and arrived in Athens, where he proceeded to demonstrate his philosophical views through a life of ostentatious poverty and cheerful contempt for everything that respectable Athenian society valued. He slept in a large ceramic jar. He owned a cup until he saw a child drinking from cupped hands, at which point he threw the cup away as unnecessary. He wandered through the marketplace at midday holding a lamp, announcing that he was looking for an honest man. When Alexander the Great, then the most powerful man in the world, came to visit him, Diogenes was lying in the sun at the time, and asked if there was anything he could do for him. Diogenes reportedly replied, "Yes, stand out of my light." Alexander later said that if he were not Alexander, he would want to be Diogenes. The exchange captures something real about the philosopher's method. By genuinely not wanting what power could offer, he was immune to power in a way that made even the most powerful person in the world briefly conscious of a freedom he did not have. Diogenes belonged to the school of thought known as cynicism, a word that originally meant not bitter worldliness, but something closer to the philosophy of the dog, kainos in Greek, meaning a life lived according to nature rather than convention, without the elaborate social structures that human beings construct to manage their anxieties about status and security. He was not performing poverty as a critique of wealth. He genuinely found that the fewer things he needed, the less anyone could threaten him, the more fully present he could be in each moment, the more clearly he could see what actually mattered. He is quoted as saying, "He has the most who is most content with the least." The paradox is serious. In a culture built on the accumulation of more comfort, more security, more status, more objects, the claim that sufficiency is already abundant sounds like provocation. But it is also in the experience of anyone who has voluntarily or involuntarily reduced their needs and found themselves, to their surprise, not worse off, something that feels like recognition. Tonight, let him ask you gently one question before sleep. What do you have right now that is enough? Let the answer, whatever it is, be sufficient for this hour. Lesson 39, Eleanor Roosevelt. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent. Eleanor Roosevelt was, by her own account, a deeply unhappy and anxious child, plain-looking in her own estimation, overshadowed by a beautiful mother who made her feel inadequate, orphaned young, raised by a grandmother she found cold. She married Franklin Roosevelt at 20 and spent the early decades of her marriage in the shadow of a domineering mother-in-law and a husband whose political career she was expected to support invisibly and without complaint. When she discovered in 1918 that Franklin was having an affair with her social secretary, she offered him a divorce. He declined, partly for political reasons. She renegotiated the terms of their relationship and in the process began to build a life of her own. What she built was extraordinary. She became a political force entirely independent of her husband, writing a daily newspaper column, hosting a radio program, traveling to places the president could not go, meeting with people whose lives the administration's formal structures did not reach. During World War II, she visited troops in the Pacific, pushing through military resistance to get to the front areas where soldiers actually were. She advocated for the desegregation of the military, for the rights of Japanese Americans in internment camps, for the inclusion of women in the war effort. She was more consistently progressive than her husband and was willing to say so publicly. After his death, she was appointed to the United States delegation to the United Nations, where she chaired the committee that drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, one of the most consequential documents of the 20th century, adopted in 1948 as a statement of the rights that belong to every human being by virtue of being human, regardless of nationality, race, or gender. She was 64 years old. She had spent her entire life being underestimated. She wrote, "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." The sentence is frequently quoted as a piece of self-help wisdom, which strips it of its weight. She was not writing from a position of comfort or natural confidence. She was writing from the experience of someone who had been made to feel inferior by her mother, by her mother-in-law, by a political culture that did not think women belonged in serious rooms, and who had decided at some point to withdraw her consent. Not because the insults stopped, but because she had found something inside herself that their continuation could not reach. Tonight, wherever you have been told, in whatever language, by whatever voice, that you are less than you are, let her long, self-built life be a reply. The consent she describes is yours to withhold. Lesson 40, a reflection on the fourth arc. 40 voices now. The night is deep, and the list of the living and the dead who have paused here is long enough to fill a room where Aristotle would be arguing quietly in one corner, Diogenes would be lying on the floor refusing a chair, Eleanor Roosevelt would be drafting something important at the table, and Ibn Battuta would be trying to describe to anyone willing to listen what the streets of 14th century Mali looked like in the early morning. What has emerged across these 40 lessons is a pattern that keeps reasserting itself in different forms. The people who shaped the world most durably were, almost without exception, people who refused to let the world's definition of them be the final one. Sojourner Truth stood up in a room full of people who doubted her capacity and offered her own existence as the evidence. Wangari Maathai planted trees in a country whose government considered her a threat. Hannah Arendt thought carefully in a century that kept trying to make careful thinking impossible. Michelangelo lay on scaffolding in physical pain and kept painting. None of them were waiting for conditions to become favorable. None of them were waiting for permission. They were working steadily, imperfectly, in the available light, with the available tools, in the conviction that the work mattered even when the world was not watching, and even when the world was actively in opposition. You are 40 lessons in, and sleep is closer now. Let the voices settle into the quiet, not as lessons to be memorized or principles to be performed, but as companions, people who have already made the journey, people who, in one way or another, found a way through. 60 more remain, they will come. For now, let this hour be what it is: the dark, the quiet, the slow loosening of the day's grip. This is explored during sleeping. Lesson 41, Plato. The cave we live in is not the world itself. Plato was born into an aristocratic Athenian family around 428 BCE, in a city at war, in a culture that considered philosophy both a noble pursuit and a dangerous one. He was a student of Socrates and was present, or near, for the trial and execution of his teacher, an event that marked him permanently and that he returned to in his writing again and again, as if trying to understand how a city could vote to kill the best man it had produced. He traveled widely after Socrates' death, studied mathematics and other disciplines, and eventually founded the Academy in Athens, the institution often considered the first university in the Western world, where he taught for the remaining 4 decades of his life. His philosophical method was the dialogue, not the treatise, not the lecture, but the living conversation between minds in genuine disagreement, circling a question from multiple directions, allowing the argument to go where it went rather than forcing it toward a predetermined conclusion. He believed that truth was not transmitted, but arrived at that genuine understanding could not be poured from one mind into another, but had to be ignited, like a flame from a flame, through the friction of honest inquiry. His most famous image is the allegory of the cave from the Republic. Prisoners are chained in a cave, facing a wall, seeing only the shadows cast by objects passing in front of a fire behind them. They have lived this way all their lives. The shadows are to them reality, the only reality they know. If one prisoner is freed and dragged out into the sunlight, the brightness is blinding and painful. The world outside the cave is overwhelming. He wants to go back. But gradually his eyes adjust, and he begins to see things as they actually are, not shadows of copies, but the objects themselves, and above them, the sun. The allegory is not primarily about ignorance in the conventional sense. It is about the difficulty of genuine perception, about the fact that the reality we take for granted, the world we move through with confidence, may itself be a kind of shadow, that the painful, disorienting process of being pulled toward a truer picture of things is not a punishment, but the only path toward genuine understanding. That the person who returns to the cave, having seen the sun, will struggle to see in the darkness and will be laughed at by those who have never left. He wrote through the voice of Socrates, "The measure of a man is what he does with power." But the deeper lesson of the cave is about vision, about what we are willing to see and what it costs to see it more clearly. Tonight, let his image of the slow, painful adjustment to light sit gently with you. What you are beginning to see more clearly, whatever it is, was always there. You are simply learning to look. Lesson 42, Zora Neale Hurston. Research is formalized curiosity. Zora Neale Hurston was born in Notasulga, Alabama, around 1891, and grew up in Eatonville, Florida, one of the first incorporated all-black municipalities in the United States, in a community that gave her an early and sustaining experience of black life as something rich, self-sufficient, and culturally sovereign rather than defined primarily by its relationship to white oppression. Her father was a Baptist preacher and 3-term mayor. Her mother died when she was 13. She was largely on her own by her early teens, working domestic jobs, following a traveling theatrical company, making her way north by stages until she arrived in Baltimore, then Washington, then New York, where she became one of the central figures of the Harlem Renaissance. She studied anthropology at Barnard College under Franz Boas, one of the founders of modern anthropology, and then returned to the South and the Caribbean to conduct fieldwork, collecting folklore, music, religious practices, and oral traditions that were disappearing under the pressure of modernization and assimilation. She drove alone through the Deep South in the 1930s, a black woman with a pistol and a recording device, talking to people in lumber camps and turpentine camps and juke joints, capturing voices and stories and songs that would have been lost entirely if she had not gone looking for them. She was doing the most dangerous possible work in the most dangerous possible place, because she believed what she was collecting mattered. Her novel Their Eyes Were Watching God, written in 7 weeks in Haiti in 1937, is now considered one of the masterworks of American literature. It was not well received at the time. Some black male critics found its celebration of Southern black vernacular culture embarrassing, too comfortable with the very conditions of life they wanted to transcend. She held to her vision anyway, understanding that the richness she was depicting was not a consolation for poverty, but a genuine human achievement, a culture that had produced beauty and meaning under conditions designed to prevent both. She wrote, "Research is formalized curiosity. It is poking and prying with a purpose." The sentence is typical of her, precise and warm at the same time, professional and personal in a single breath. She brought her whole self to the work, the anthropologist and the storyteller, the scholar and the woman who loved the people she was studying, the trained observer and the person who had grown up inside the tradition she was recording. Tonight, let her remind you that curiosity is not a distraction from serious work. It is the engine of the most serious work of all. Whatever you are drawn to understand, follow it. It is pulling you somewhere worth going. Lesson 43, Baruch Spinoza. Freedom is understanding what you cannot change. Baruch Spinoza was excommunicated from the Amsterdam Jewish community in 1656, at the age of 23. In the harshest terms the community had available, the Cherem document that formally cast him out did not specify his offences, only condemned him in language so severe that historians have spent centuries speculating about what exactly he had said or done to provoke it. He never rejoined the community. He lived quietly for the rest of his short life, dying at 44 of lung disease, probably aggravated by the glass dust from the lenses he ground for a living writing philosophy that was considered so dangerous that his major works were published posthumously, under his initials rather than his name, and were immediately placed on the Catholic Church's index of forbidden books. He was dangerous because he was consistent. Starting from premises that his critics could not immediately fault, he followed arguments to conclusions that overturned the dominant religious understanding of God, free will, the soul, and the nature of human happiness. God for Spinoza was not a personal being who intervened in history and responded to prayer, but was identical with nature itself, the infinite, self-causing substance of which everything that exists is a mode or expression. There was no creation separate from God, no miracles that violated natural law, no immortal soul that escaped the body at death. There was only the infinite, eternal, necessary unfolding of what is. This sounds cold, and Spinoza's critics used it to accuse him of atheism, but his ethical system, built on this foundation, was anything but cold. He argued that human suffering arose primarily from the dominance of the passions, the reactive emotions of fear, hope, jealousy, and desire that bounce us between things we cannot control, and that freedom consisted not in escaping these emotions through willpower, but in understanding them. When you understand why you feel what you feel, when you trace the cause back through the chain of necessity that produced it, the emotion loses its coercive power. You are still in the world, but you are no longer merely at its mercy. He wrote, "I have striven not to laugh at human actions, not to weep at them, nor to hate them, but to understand them." The striving he describes is not detachment. It is a specific quality of attention, patient, honest, willing to follow causes wherever they led, resistant to the comfort of easy judgment. Understanding for Spinoza was the highest form of love, and love, in this sense, was the only freedom available to a human being embedded in a world of necessity. Tonight, let his quiet, lens-grinding life be a companion. He was cast out, forbidden, and nearly forgotten. He kept thinking. What he found in the solitude of that thinking was something that neither exclusion nor illness could take from him. Lesson 44, Nikola Tesla, already covered. Replacing with Sun Tzu, know yourself as well as you know your enemy. Sun Tzu is believed to have lived in ancient China during the late spring and autumn period, around the 5th century BCE. A time of near-constant warfare among competing states. The Art of War, the text attributed to him, is among the oldest military treatises in the world and almost certainly the most widely read. It has been translated into dozens of languages, studied by military commanders across centuries and cultures, and applied with varying degrees of literalness to business strategy, sports coaching, negotiation, and the management of organizations that have nothing to do with war. The text is short, 13 chapters, a few thousand words in most translations, and proceeds in a tone of absolute calm certainty. There is no drama in it, no celebration of valor, no glorification of the warrior spirit. War for Sun Tzu is an expensive, dangerous, fundamentally regrettable undertaking that should be avoided if possible, and if not possible, concluded as quickly and decisively as possible. The highest form of victory is to defeat the enemy without fighting at all, through preparation, through the management of information, through creating conditions in which the enemy's defeat is inevitable before the battle begins. The general who must fight hard to win has already, in some sense, failed. What gives the text its enduring relevance is that its underlying principles are not about armies. They are about the nature of conflict, strategy, information, and self-knowledge in any domain where stakes are real and outcomes matter. The most quoted passage, the one that has moved most completely beyond its military context, is the instruction to know the enemy and know yourself, in which case the text says, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. Know only yourself and not the enemy, and you will win one battle and lose the next. Know neither yourself nor the enemy, and you will fail in every battle. The self-knowledge he is describing is not the introspective self-knowledge of therapy or philosophy, though it overlaps with both. It is the precise, unsentimental assessment of your own capacities, limitations, resources, and tendencies, the kind of honest inventory that is extremely difficult to take because it requires setting aside the version of yourself you prefer to believe in and looking at what is actually there. Most failures, Sun Tzu implies, begin not with insufficient knowledge of the opponent, but with insufficient knowledge of oneself. He wrote, victorious warriors win first and then go to war, while defeated warriors go to war first and then seek to win. The preparation comes before the engagement. The outcome is determined in large part before the conflict begins. Tonight, whatever challenge you are carrying into tomorrow, let this thought rest with you. What do you actually know about your own strengths and limits? That knowledge, honestly held, is already a form of readiness. Lesson 45, Toni Morrison. Language is the only homeland. Toni Morrison grew up in Lorain, Ohio, in a family that told stories. Her grandfather had played violin by ear and read the signs in dreams. Her mother sang. The community around her was saturated with an oral tradition that carried history and warning and beauty in forms that did not require literacy to transmit. She became one of the most celebrated novelists in the history of American literature, the first Black woman to receive the Nobel Prize in Literature, and a writer whose work insisted, with extraordinary precision and force, that the interior lives of Black Americans were as complex, as worthy of full literary attention, as the interior lives of anyone who had ever been given that attention by default. She worked for decades as an editor at Random House while writing her own novels, The Bluest Eye, Sula, Song of Solomon, Tar Baby, Beloved, Jazz, Paradise, and others, often writing in the hours before her children woke, in the early morning dark, because those were the hours available to her. Beloved, published in 1987, is based on the true story of Margaret Garner, an enslaved woman who killed her infant daughter rather than allow her to be returned to slavery. A story Morrison described as the most terrible expression of a mother's love she had ever encountered, and which she spent years finding a way to tell without making it bearable, without smoothing its horror into something more comfortable than it was. The Nobel lecture she delivered in Stockholm in 1993 is itself one of the great pieces of prose writing of the 20th century, a meditation on the nature of language, on what it means to use words with care, on the difference between language that opens the world and language that closes it. She spoke of a blind old woman, a wise woman, who is visited by young people with a living bird, and asked whether it is alive or dead. She does not answer. She says, I don't know whether the bird you are holding is dead or alive, but what I do know is that it is in your hands. It is in your hands. She said, if you have some power, then your job is to empower somebody else. She spent her editorial career championing writers who would not otherwise have found publishers. She spent her writing career building a body of work that gave language to experiences that had been largely without it in American literature. The power she had, she used to make more room. Tonight, let the words you carry, the ones that have opened something in you, the ones that have reached you across the distance of someone else's life and made you feel less alone, let them settle quietly. Language, she believed, is not a tool. It is the place where we live. Lesson 46, Pythagoras, the universe speaks in numbers. Pythagoras of Samos lived in the 6th century BCE and left behind no writings of his own. Everything attributed to him was recorded by others, often centuries later, making it genuinely difficult to separate the historical figure from the legend that accumulated around him. What is clear is that he founded a community in Croton, in what is now southern Italy, that was part philosophical school, part religious brotherhood, part political organization, and that this community developed ideas about mathematics, music, and the structure of reality that were genuinely revolutionary, and that continued to influence thinkers for 2.5 millennia. theorem that bears his name, that in a right triangle, the square of the hypotenuse equals the sum of the squares of the other two sides, was known in various forms in Babylon and Egypt before he was born. What the Pythagorean tradition contributed was not the theorem alone, but the insight behind it, that mathematical relationships are not just useful tools for measuring fields and constructing buildings, but are features of reality itself. The world is not merely described by mathematics. The world is mathematical. Number is not a human invention imposed on nature. It is the language in which nature is written. This idea had practical consequences. The Pythagoreans discovered that musical harmonies corresponded to simple numerical ratios, that the intervals between notes that the human ear finds pleasing are not arbitrary but reflect mathematical relationships between the lengths of vibrating strings. The octave is a ratio of 2 to 1, the perfect fifth is 3 to 2, the perfect fourth is 4 to 3. Beauty in music turned out to be a form of mathematical order made audible. The universe, they concluded, was itself a kind of music, a harmony of the spheres, as they called it, in which the motions of the celestial bodies produced a sound too vast and too constant for human ears to detect. The Pythagorean worldview was absorbed into Platonic philosophy, into the astronomy of Kepler, into the physics of Newton and Einstein. The conviction that the deepest truths about the universe are mathematical in character, that when you strip away the surface complexity of phenomena and look for the underlying structure, you find number and ratio and proportion, has been one of the most productive ideas in the history of science. He is attributed with saying, "Number is the ruler of forms and ideas and the cause of gods and demons." Whether he said it or not, the idea is his. Tonight, let the quiet order underneath the noise of the world, the ratios and patterns that hold things together, be something you carry into sleep. The universe is not random. It hums with structure. Pythagoras heard it first. Lesson 47, Simón Bolívar, liberation without justice is only another form of chains. Simón Bolívar was born in Caracas in 1783 into one of the wealthiest Creole families in Venezuela, a family that owned land, mines, and enslaved people, and whose prosperity was built entirely on the colonial system he would spend his adult life trying to destroy. He was orphaned young, educated partly in Europe, and returned to South America saturated with Enlightenment ideas about liberty, equality, and the rights of man. He stood on a hill in Rome in 1805, according to his own account, and swore that he would not rest until he had liberated his homeland from Spanish rule. He was 22 years old. What followed was one of the most remarkable military and political careers in the history of the Americas. Over the course of nearly 2 decades, he led campaigns across an area larger than the whole of Europe, through jungles, over the Andes in conditions that military historians still consider almost impossible, losing battles and beginning again, building armies from whatever was available, forging alliances that held and alliances that shattered. He liberated Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, the last named in his honor, from Spanish colonial rule. He was, for a period, the most powerful political figure in South America. And then, in the decade before his death in 1830, he watched everything he had built begin to fracture. The unified republic he had dreamed of, Gran Colombia, stretching across the northern continent, broke apart under the pressure of regional rivalries, personal ambitions, and the deep structural inequalities that the revolution had not, in the end, dismantled. The enslaved people whose labor had built the colonial economy were not fully free. The indigenous populations whose land had been taken were not restored. The Creole elite had replaced the Spanish at the top of a hierarchy that remained, in its fundamental shape, unchanged. He said near the end of his life, "America is ungovernable. Those who serve the revolution plow the sea. The bitterness is real, but it does not erase what he understood, and what he said explicitly in speeches and letters throughout his career, which is that political independence without economic justice and social equality is not liberation but substitution. One set of rulers for another, the form of freedom without the substance." Tonight, let his incomplete revolution be an honest teacher. The hardest work is not overthrowing what is wrong. It is building, carefully and justly, what should replace it. Lesson 48, Virginia Woolf. A room of one's own is the beginning of everything. Virginia Woolf was born in 1882 into a household full of books and brilliant people, and also full of grief. Her mother died when she was 13, her half-sister shortly after, and she suffered the first of several serious mental breakdowns in the years that followed. She was educated at home, in the way that girls of her class and time were educated at home, which is to say, she had access to her father's extraordinary library and none of the formal instruction that her brothers received at school and university. She was aware of this discrepancy and returned to it throughout her life, and writing with an anger that she had learned to express with surgical precision rather than raw force. She became one of the central figures of literary modernism, the author of Mrs. Dalloway, To the Lighthouse, Orlando, The Waves, and a body of essays and criticism that are as important as her fiction. She co-founded the Hogarth Press with her husband Leonard, which published not only her own work but early editions of T.S. Eliot, Catherine Mansfield, and Sigmund Freud's collected papers in English translation. She was, simultaneously, a major creative artist and a significant force in the literary culture of her time. In 1929, she published A Room of One's Own, based on lectures she had given at Cambridge, a long essay that remains one of the most important works of feminist literary criticism ever written. Its central argument is deceptively simple. A woman who wishes to write fiction needs money and a room of her own, not metaphorically, literally. The physical conditions for intellectual work are not luxuries, they are prerequisites. And for most of history, for most women, those conditions were systematically denied, not by conspiracy but by the accumulated weight of custom, expectation, economic dependence, and the thousand small ways that women's time and space were considered less their own than men's. She wrote, "You cannot find peace by avoiding life." She knew this from direct experience. Her life was full of difficulty, loss, illness, and the constant effort to maintain the conditions in which she could think and write. She did not avoid it. She wrote into it, through it, making from the difficulty itself the material of some of the most searching prose of the century. Tonight, whatever space you have found, or are still trying to find, let her remind you that the claim to a room, to time, to the conditions of your own thinking, is not selfish. It is the beginning of everything else. Lesson 49, Galileo Galilei, already covered in Lesson 19, replacing with Rabindranath Tagore, beauty is not separate from truth. Rabindranath Tagore was born in Calcutta in 1861, into one of the most remarkable intellectual and artistic families in Indian history, a family that had been at the center of the Bengal Renaissance, a broad cultural and philosophical movement that engaged seriously with both the ancient traditions of Indian thought and the intellectual currents coming from Europe. He was educated partly at home, partly in England, and partly, as he always said, by his own wide and ungovernable reading and by the landscape of Bengal itself. The rivers, the monsoons, the quality of light on water that he returned to in his poetry throughout his life. He wrote poetry, novels, short stories, plays, essays, and songs. He composed more than 2,000 songs, which form a distinct genre in Bengali music called Rabindra Sangeet, and are still sung throughout Bangladesh and West Bengal today. He founded an experimental school, Visvabharati, based on the ancient Indian tradition of the forest ashram, learning in the open air, in contact with nature, oriented not toward examination and credentials, but toward the full development of the human being. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1913, the first non-European to receive it, for the collection Gitanjali, a series of devotional poems that combined deep spiritual intensity with a simplicity of image that moved readers who knew nothing of the tradition from which they came. He was not a simple figure. He admired aspects of the British intellectual tradition while opposing colonial rule. He criticized Gandhi's nationalism while sharing Gandhi's commitment to Indian self-determination. He believed that the divisions between nations, religions, and cultures were human constructions that obscured a deeper unity, and he spent his life trying to give that unity a form that could be felt in music and poetry and education, rather than only argued for in the abstract. He wrote, "The highest education is that which does not merely give us information, but makes our life in harmony with all existence." The harmony he described was not passive agreement with the world, but active participation in it, a quality of attention and responsiveness that could be cultivated, that was itself a form of understanding deeper than any information. Tonight, let his long, music-filled life be a reminder that the beautiful and the true are not in different rooms. They are, at their depth, the same reaching toward what is real. Lesson 50, a reflection on the halfway point. 50 voices, the halfway mark in a journey of 100 minds, and the night is fully settled now. The world outside quiet, the breath slower, the body beginning its long nightly work of restoration and repair. This is the midpoint, and it is worth pausing here in the dark to notice what has accumulated. We have heard from ancient Greeks who questioned everything, from medieval Persian poets who made grief into music, from scientists who spent decades preparing a single idea for the world, from women who were excluded from the rooms where knowledge was made and who kept making knowledge anyway. We have heard from a man who slept in a jar and threw away his cup, from a woman who planted 50 million trees, from a novelist who wrote before her children woke, because those were the only hours available, from a general who said that the highest victory is the one that requires no battle at all. What these 50 lives have in common is not intelligence in the narrow sense, not privilege, not ease, not even success as the world usually measures it. What they share is a quality of orientation, a fundamental turning toward rather than away, toward the question, toward the difficulty, toward the other person, toward the work that needed doing whether or not anyone was watching or rewarding. A refusal, in each case, to let the conditions of their lives be the final word about what their lives could mean. You are at the midpoint. 50 more voices are waiting, voices from every corner of the world, every century, every discipline, every kind of human experience. They will come one at a time, at the pace of sleep, unhurried. There is no test at the end. There is only the accumulation of company, the slow gathering of people who found something worth passing on and who are, across the distance of years and languages and vastly different circumstances, still passing it on. Let the night hold you now. Let these 50 voices settle into the quiet like stones settling to the bottom of still water. They are not going anywhere. Neither are you. Lesson 51, Socrates already covered. Replacing with Avicenna, the body and the mind are not enemies. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, was born in 980 CE in Persia, near the city of Bokhara, and had memorized the Quran by the age of 10 and mastered the medicine of his era by 16. He was one of those rare minds that seemed to accelerate rather than slow as the material grew harder. By his early 20s, he had written his first major philosophical works. By his mid-30s, he had completed the Canon of Medicine, a million-word encyclopedia of medical knowledge that would be used as a primary medical textbook in European universities for 600 years. He worked as a physician, a philosopher, a scientist, and a court official simultaneously, writing in the hours between duties, sometimes dictating while on horseback during military campaigns. He understood the human being as a unified whole, not a soul trapped in a body, not a body that happened to generate a soul, but an integrated living system in which physical health and mental state were constantly influencing each other. He wrote extensively about the role of emotion in physical illness, about the relationship between diet and mood, about the way grief and fear and joy left their marks on the body as surely as any fever. He described what we would now call psychosomatic medicine nearly 1,000 years before the term existed, not as mysticism, but as careful clinical observation. His famous thought experiment, the floating man, a person suspended in air with no sensory input whatsoever, was designed to demonstrate that self-awareness, the simple fact of knowing that you exist, persists even when the body contributes nothing. You would still know that you are. The self is not reducible to the senses. But it is also, in his framework, not separable from the body in any practical sense. They rise and fall together. What harms one harms the other. What heals one heals the other. He wrote, "The knowledge of anything, since all things have causes, is not acquired or complete unless it is known by its causes." For Avicenna, this meant that treating a symptom without understanding its origin was not medicine, it was guesswork. The cause had to be found, the whole system had to be seen. Tonight, let his integrated vision rest with you. Whatever you are carrying in the body and the mind, it is one thing, not two. Tend to it as a whole. Lesson 52, Harriet Tubman, already covered. Replacing with Confucius, already covered. Replacing with Nikola Tesla, already covered. Replacing with Thich Nhat Hanh, peace is every step. Thich Nhat Hanh was born in Vietnam in 1926, ordained as a Buddhist monk at 16, and spent the following decades doing something that the traditions around him had not fully prepared him for, trying to practice peace in the middle of a war. During the Vietnam War, he founded the School of Youth for Social Service, which trained volunteers to go into bombed villages and rebuild homes, establish schools and care for the wounded, refusing to take sides militarily while refusing equally to look away from suffering. He called this approach engaged Buddhism, the conviction that meditation and compassionate action were not alternatives but expressions of the same practice. He was exiled from Vietnam in 1966 for his peace advocacy and would not return for nearly 4 decades. He built a community in France called Plum Village, which became one of the largest Buddhist communities in the Western world, and he wrote more than 100 books on mindfulness, compassion, and the practice of presence. He taught in a language stripped of jargon, direct, warm, accessible, because he believed that the insights of contemplative practice were not the property of monks and scholars, but belonged to anyone willing to slow down enough to receive them. His central teaching was almost embarrassingly simple. The present moment is the only place where life actually happens. Not the past, which exists only as memory, not the future, which exists only as anticipation. This breath, this step, this cup of tea held in both hands, this is where you are. This is what is real. The practice is not to achieve some special state, but to return again and again to what is already here. He called it into being, the recognition that nothing exists in isolation, that everything is connected to everything else in a web of mutual arising, that makes the boundary between self and world more permeable than it appears. He wrote, "The present moment is the only moment available to us, and it is the door to all moments." The sentence is not a comfort exactly. It makes no promises about what the present moment will contain. It only insists that this is where you are, and that being fully here is itself a form of arrival. Tonight, let his quiet certainty reach you. You are already in the only place there is. That is enough. Lesson 53, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Whatever you can do, begin it. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe was a poet, novelist, playwright, scientist, and statesman who lived for 82 extraordinarily productive years in Germany, and who was regarded during his lifetime as the greatest living European writer, a position he occupied with considerable self-awareness and occasional irritation. He is best known for Faust, the dramatic poem he worked on for 60 years, completing the second part just months before his death. But his output across every form of writing was enormous, and his scientific work, particularly his theory of colors and his studies of plant morphology, occupied him with equal seriousness, even when the scientific establishment dismissed it. What Goethe modeled, across a life of extraordinary length and variety, was the productive use of beginning. He did not wait for conditions to be perfect or for inspiration to arrive fully formed. He started, with whatever was at hand, in whatever condition he was in, and trusted that the act of beginning would generate the energy and clarity that waiting never could. He wrote letters, he sketched, he took notes, he drafted scenes for plays he had not yet planned, he began scientific observations without knowing where they would lead. The beginning was not a preliminary to the real work. The beginning was the real work. He is attributed with a passage, frequently misattributed but philosophically consistent with his expressed views, that captures this conviction, that in the act of commitment, of beginning with full intention, something shifts in the universe around you. Coincidences arise. Assistance comes from directions you did not anticipate. The world, it seems, responds to the person who has genuinely decided. Whether or not this is literally true, the practical observation behind it is sound. The person who has begun is in a fundamentally different relationship to the work than the person who is still preparing to begin. He wrote, "Whatever you can do or dream you can do, begin it." Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. The magic he is describing is not supernatural. It is the ordinary magic of commitment, the way that deciding changes what is possible, the way that beginning makes the next step visible in a way that no amount of planning from a standing position ever could. Tonight, let whatever you have been postponing rest more lightly. The beginning is already available. It has been available all along. Lesson 54, Desmond Tutu. Forgiveness is not forgetting, it is refusing to be defined by the wound. Desmond Tutu was born in 1931 in Klerksdorp, South Africa, the son of a school teacher, and grew up in a country that had constructed an entire legal and social architecture around the premise that some human beings were worth less than others based solely on the color of their skin. He became an Anglican priest, then a bishop, then the Archbishop of Cape Town, and throughout that ascent, he was one of the most persistent and unignorable voices calling for the end of apartheid, using his position in the church as a platform from which no government could entirely silence him, though several tried. After apartheid ended and Nelson Mandela was elected president, Tutu chaired the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a body unlike almost anything that had existed before in the aftermath of systematic state violence. The Commission's premise was radical, that perpetrators of human rights abuses could apply for amnesty in exchange for full public disclosure of what they had done. Victims and their families could testify. The truth would be spoken aloud, in public, on the record, not buried in the interests of a convenient national peace that left the wounds unacknowledged. What Tutu brought to this work was a theology of forgiveness that was precise and demanding, not a soft letting go, not the erasure of what had happened, not a demand that victims pretend they had not suffered. Forgiveness, as he understood and taught it, was the refusal to allow the perpetrator permanent power over the victim's future. To forgive is not to forget. It is to decide that the wound will not be the organizing principle of the rest of your life. It is to reclaim the future from the person who damaged the past. He wrote, "Without forgiveness, there is no future." He did not say forgiveness is easy. He knew it was not. He sat with people who had lost children, spouses, parents to state violence and asked them to find it anyway, not for the sake of the perpetrators, but for their own sake. The future he was pointing toward was theirs to build if they could loosen the grip of what had been done to them. Tonight, whatever you are holding from someone who hurt you, let his long, patient understanding of forgiveness sit with you. You do not have to release it tonight, but you are allowed to. Lesson 55, Leonardo da Vinci, already covered. Replacing with Maimonides, reason and faith can walk the same road. Moses ben Maimon, known as Maimonides, was born in Cordoba, Spain, in 1138, into a world of extraordinary intellectual richness and growing danger. The Jewish community of Andalusia had flourished for centuries under relatively tolerant Islamic rule, producing philosophers, poets, and scholars who moved freely between Arabic and Hebrew thought. Then the Almohad dynasty swept in from North Africa, demanding conversion or exile, and Maimonides' family began a decades-long journey that took them across North Africa and eventually to Egypt, where he spent the rest of his life as a physician and the leading Jewish scholar of his age. He wrote his philosophical masterwork, The Guide for the Perplexed, for students who were caught between two worlds, who had absorbed Aristotelian philosophy and found it, in some ways, more rigorous and coherent than the literal readings of religious texts they had been given, and who were therefore perplexed, genuinely uncertain about how to hold both things without abandoning one for the other. His answer was careful and ambitious. The apparent contradictions between reason and revelation dissolve, he argued, when you read scripture correctly, not literally where literalism produces absurdity, but with the understanding that the deepest truths require the deepest interpretation. He brought the same rigor to medicine that he brought to philosophy. He wrote treatises on asthma, on poisons and their antidotes, on the preservation of health through diet and sleep and emotional balance. He served as physician to the court of Saladin's family in Cairo. He wrote that the health of the body and the health of the soul were inseparable, that a person could not think clearly while physically depleted, and could not be physically well while spiritually disordered. He wrote, "Teach thy tongue to say, I do not know, and thou shalt progress." The admission of not knowing was not, for him, a defeat. It was the necessary beginning of genuine inquiry, the clearing of the ground on which real understanding could eventually be built. Tonight, let whatever you do not yet understand rest without shame. Not knowing is where the path begins. Lesson 56, Anton Chekhov. Show the truth quietly and it will outlast any sermon. Anton Chekhov was a physician who wrote fiction and plays in his spare time. Or, more accurately, a writer who practiced medicine because he understood that his patients needed him and that the work of seeing suffering up close was inseparable from his ability to write about human beings with genuine accuracy. He was born in 1860 in Taganrog, in southern Russia, the grandson of a serf who had bought his family's freedom, and he worked his way through medical school, supporting himself and his family through the sale of short comic pieces to newspapers. By the time he had established a serious literary reputation, he had already seen more of ordinary Russian life, in hospital wards, in provincial towns, in the homes of the desperately poor, than most writers of his era would encounter in a lifetime. His method was radical in its restraint. He did not explain his characters. He did not tell the reader what to feel. He did not arrange events to point toward a moral. He showed a gesture, a silence, an object on a table, a word said when a different word was clearly meant, and trusted the reader to feel the full weight of what was happening without being told what that weight was. He once wrote that if a gun appears on stage in the first act, it must go off by the third. What he meant was that nothing in a true story is accidental. Everything the reader is shown is load-bearing. Nothing is decoration. He died at 44 of tuberculosis, a disease he had likely contracted from his patients, that he had diagnosed in himself years before it killed him, and that he continued working through until very near the end. His final years produced some of the greatest plays ever written: The Seagull, Uncle Vanya, Three Sisters, The Cherry Orchard, works in which nothing much happens in the conventional dramatic sense, and in which, beneath the surface of apparently ordinary conversation, entire lives are being lost and found and lost again. He wrote, "Don't tell me the moon is shining, show me the glint of light on broken glass." The sentence is the whole of his teaching, not the statement of the truth, but the presentation of the detail from which the truth rises. Tonight, trust what you see, trust the detail. It knows more than the explanation. Lesson 57, Copernicus. Being wrong about your place is the beginning of getting it right. Nicolaus Copernicus spent most of his working life as a canon of the Catholic Church in the small Polish town of Frombork, managing church properties, practicing medicine for the local poor, and in the evenings doing astronomy. He was not a professional astronomer. He had no telescope. It would not be invented for another century. He had inherited instruments, careful observation records, and the accumulated astronomical data of antiquity, and he spent decades staring at this data and noticing something that no one had been able to adequately explain. The planets, as observed from Earth, behaved in ways that required increasingly complicated mathematical patches to account for if the Earth was assumed to be stationary at the center of everything. He proposed a simpler explanation. The Earth moves. It is one planet among others, all of them circling the Sun. The apparent complexity of planetary motion is largely an artifact of observing a moving solar system from a moving planet. His model was not perfect. He retained circular orbits, which Kepler would later correct to ellipses, but it was the decisive break. It placed the human species, for the first time in recorded history, in its actual position, not at the center, but in orbit on a small planet, circling an ordinary star. He hesitated to publish for years, not primarily from fear of the church, historians now believe, but from the perfectionism of a man who knew his model still had problems he had not solved. He finally allowed publication in 1543 and received the first printed copy, by most accounts, on the day he died. He did not live to see the revolution his idea would ignite. What he discovered was not just an astronomical fact. It was a posture, the willingness to question where you stand, to consider that the vantage point you have always assumed was fixed might itself be in motion, that the complexity of the world might be, in part, a reflection of the limitations of your position within it. He wrote, "To know that we know what we know, and to know that we do not know what we do not know, that is true knowledge." Tonight, let his patient, peripheral, sky-watching life be a reminder. The center is not always where you think you are. Moving from it may be the beginning of seeing clearly. Lesson 58, George Orwell. Clarity of language is clarity of thought. George Orwell was born Eric Arthur Blair in British India in 1903, educated at Eton on a scholarship, and then, refusing the expected path into university, joined the Imperial Police in Burma, where he spent 5 years enforcing a colonial system he found morally insupportable and that he left as soon as he felt he could. He returned to Europe. Spent time deliberately living among the poor of Paris and London, worked as a dishwasher, a hop picker, a bookshop assistant, and eventually a writer, producing journalism, essays, novels, and criticism of a clarity and moral seriousness that made him, by the end of his short life, one of the most important prose writers in the English language. He was shot through the throat by a sniper in Spain during the Civil War, where he had gone to fight on the side of the Republic. He survived. He was hunted afterward by Stalinist agents for his association with a dissident socialist militia. He survived that too. He contracted tuberculosis, which he managed for the last decade of his life with the help of antibiotics that had only recently become available, and died in 1950 at 46, just after completing 1984. His essay Politics and the English Language, published in 1946, is the most precise account ever written of the relationship between vague language and dishonest thought. His argument was simple. When people write in abstract, evasive, bureaucratic language, it is usually because they are either confused about what they mean or unwilling to say it plainly. Clear language requires clear thought. And clear thought is uncomfortable. It forces you to commit to specific claims that can be agreed with or disputed, rather than hiding in formulations that mean everything and therefore nothing. He wrote, "In a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act." The revolution he described was not dramatic. It was the daily, unglamorous discipline of saying what you actually mean, of calling things by their real names, of refusing the comfort of the official version when the evidence suggests otherwise. Tonight, let his plain, fierce voice be a companion. Whatever is true in your life, say it, at least to yourself. Plainly, it is enough. Lesson 59, Hildegard of Bingen. The creative life is a sacred life. Hildegard of Bingen was born in 1098 in the Rhineland, the 10th child of a noble family, and was given to the church as a tithe, a not uncommon practice for younger children of large families at the age of 8. She entered the Benedictine monastery at Sibbodenberg and spent the next 4 decades there, learning, praying, and experiencing visions that she kept largely private until she was in her 40s, when a voice told her to write them down. She was then the leader of her community, a position she had assumed in her 30s, and already a woman of considerable institutional standing. She asked her confessor. He asked the Archbishop of Mainz. The Archbishop asked the Pope. The Pope said yes. She began to write. What she produced over the following decades was extraordinary in its range. She wrote theological works describing her visions in rich, hallucinatory imagery. She wrote 2 books of natural science and medicine, drawing on the extensive herbal and healing knowledge of the monastery. She composed more than 70 pieces of music, sacred songs, and a liturgical drama that represent the largest surviving body of music by any composer of the medieval period, male or female. She invented an alternative alphabet. She wrote letters to popes, emperors, and abbots, advising and occasionally rebuking them with a directness that she justified by presenting herself as merely the vessel for a divine voice, a rhetorical move that gave her unusual license in a world that did not expect women to speak with authority. She understood creativity not as self-expression but as participation. as the human capacity to take part in the ongoing act of making that she believed was the fundamental nature of the divine. The viriditas, the greening power, the vital force that she saw animating all of nature, was the same force she felt when she composed music or described a vision. To create was to align with something larger than the self. She wrote, "We cannot live in a world that is not our own, in a world that is interpreted for us by others." The room she claimed for vision, for music, for science, for speech, she claimed with divine permission and extraordinary courage. Tonight, let her 900-year-old voice remind you, what you make is a form of participation. It matters because you are in it. Lesson 60, a reflection on the sixth arc. 60 voices, 3/5 of the way through a century of minds, and the night has held you faithfully through all of them. In this arc, we have heard from a Persian physician who understood the body and mind as a single system, from a Vietnamese monk who found the present moment sufficient, from a German poet who said, "Begin," from a South African archbishop who knew that forgiveness was not softness, but the refusal to let damage govern the future. From a medieval abbess who composed music and wrote science and spoke to emperors because a voice told her to, and she trusted it. Each of these figures found their way to the same essential posture, a quality of presence, of engagement, of willingness to be fully in the life they had been given rather than waiting for a different one. Avicenna wrote on horseback, Chekhov wrote between patients, Hildegard wrote in a monastery she had entered as a child tithe. Orwell wrote with tuberculosis, with a bullet wound in his throat, with the knowledge that the time available to him was limited, and that plain language was the only tool he trusted enough to use. What none of them did was wait, not for permission, not for better conditions, not for the fear to pass, not for the world to become more hospitable to what they were trying to do. They worked in the available time with the available tools, in the rooms they actually had. 40 lessons remain. The voices are still coming from every century, every continent, every form of human striving. Let them come slowly. The night is long enough. You have already come more than halfway. This is Explore During Sleeping. Lesson 61, Voltaire. Doubt everything except the obligation to think. François-Marie Arouet, who took the pen name Voltaire, was imprisoned in the Bastille twice, exiled from France, and spent large portions of his adult life writing from just beyond the reach of governments and churches that would have preferred he stop. He was the most famous intellectual in 18th century Europe, a position he used with calculated precision, not to build a philosophical system, not to found a school of thought, but to attack relentlessly and with devastating wit the institutions he believed were responsible for most preventable human suffering. Religious fanaticism, judicial torture, censorship, and the comfortable certainty of people who had never examined what they claimed to know. His novella Candide, published in 1759, is a savage comedy about a young man who has been taught by his tutor that this is the best of all possible worlds, a parody of the philosopher Leibniz, and who then proceeds to experience war, earthquake, slavery, murder, and every other variety of catastrophe the 18th century had to offer. The book's conclusion is not despair but a kind of practical wisdom. We must cultivate our garden. Not solve the world, not explain the world, not find a system that makes the suffering acceptable. Tend to the small piece of earth in front of you, with honesty and without illusion. He fought specific battles for specific people, most famously for Jean Carlos, a Protestant merchant wrongfully broken on the wheel for the alleged murder of his son, whose conviction Voltaire spent years campaigning to overturn, eventually succeeding posthumously. He understood that abstract arguments about justice meant nothing if they could not be made to matter in the case of an actual human being who had been destroyed by a system that preferred its own convenience to the truth. He wrote, "Judge a man by his questions rather than his answers." The questions, for Voltaire, were always more honest than the answers, more revealing of what a mind was actually doing, less available for disguise and performance. A person who asks well is a person who is genuinely thinking. Tonight, let one of your real questions, the kind you have not yet said aloud, be present in the room with you. It does not need an answer yet, it only needs to be held. Lesson 62, Frida Kahlo, Pain Made Visible Becomes Power. Frida Kahlo was 6 years old when she contracted polio, which left her right leg thinner and shorter than her left. She was 18 when the bus she was riding in Mexico City was struck by a tram, breaking her spinal column, her collarbone, her right leg in 11 places, her pelvis, and driving a steel handrail through her hip and out the other side. She was not expected to survive. She survived, spent months in a full-body cast, and began to paint lying on her back, using a mirror mounted above her bed, making portraits of herself because, as she said, she was the subject she knew best. She underwent 35 surgeries over the course of her life. She lived in chronic pain of a severity that would have been the defining fact of most people's existence, and it was a defining fact of hers, but it was not the only one. She painted with extraordinary precision and psychological depth, creating a visual language that drew on Mexican folk art, pre-Columbian imagery, surrealism, and the most direct possible engagement with her own body and its history of damage and endurance. She did not aestheticize the pain. She depicted it plainly, with the same unflinching attention she gave to everything else she saw. She loved fiercely, fought publicly, held strong political convictions, wore traditional Tehuana dress as a political statement about Mexican identity, and was celebrated during her lifetime, though not always in the terms she would have chosen, as the wife of Diego Rivera rather than as the artist she was. The reassessment came later, and it came decisively. She is now recognized as one of the most important painters of the 20th century, and her self-portraits are among the most psychologically complex images in the history of art. She wrote, "I tried to drown my sorrows, but the bastards learned how to swim." The humor is characteristic, the refusal to be solemn about suffering, the insistence on meeting it with a kind of fierce irreverence that refuses it the dignity of tragedy. Tonight, whatever you are carrying in the body or in the mind, let her stubborn, paint-covered, undefeated life be a companion. She made art from what broke her. That is always available to you too. Lesson 63, Baruch Spinoza, already covered. Replacing with Archimedes, the deepest truths reveal themselves to the prepared mind. Archimedes of Syracuse lived in the 3rd century BCE and is remembered for leaping from his bath and running naked through the streets of Syracuse shouting Eureka. I have found it, upon realizing that a body submerged in water displaces a volume of water equal to its own volume, which gave him a method for measuring irregular shapes. Whether the story is literally true is uncertain. What is certain is that it captures something real about how his mind worked, the sudden, almost physical shock of a principle snapping into place after long preparation, the way genuine discovery feels less like construction than like uncovering something that was already there. He calculated the value of pi to extraordinary accuracy using a method of inscribing and circumscribing polygons around a circle. He established the mathematical principles of the lever and the pulley, and reportedly said that given a place to stand and a lever long enough, he could move the earth. He designed war machines for the defense of Syracuse against the Romans, catapults, cranes that could lift enemy ships from the water and dash them against rocks, that held a superior Roman force at bay for 2 years. When Syracuse finally fell, a Roman soldier found him drawing geometric figures in the sand and killed him despite orders that he be taken alive. He is said to have told the soldier not to disturb his circles. What Archimedes modeled was the prepared mind, the mind that has done so much careful, patient, foundational work that when the insight arrives, it has somewhere to land. The bath was not the moment of discovery, it was the moment of recognition. The discovery had been building for years in the accumulated pressure of a problem that a prepared mind had been holding without forcing. The preparation is the work. The insight is the reward for the preparation. He wrote on the principle of leverage, "Give me a place to stand and I will move the earth." He meant it as a demonstration of mathematical principle. It works equally as a statement of method. Position yourself correctly, build the right foundation, and the leverage becomes available. Tonight, let whatever you have been carefully preparing, in whatever domain, over whatever length of time, rest in the confidence that the preparation is not separate from the discovery. It is the discovery, accumulating slowly toward the moment it becomes visible. Lesson 64, James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. James Baldwin was born in Harlem in 1924, the eldest of 9 children, raised by a stepfather who was a preacher and who instilled in him a familiarity with the cadences of the King James Bible that would mark his prose for the rest of his life. He was black, poor, and gay in a country that was, in each of those respects, structured against him, and he became one of the most incandescent writers America has ever produced, a man whose essays and novels and plays held a mirror up to the country's face with a steadiness that many people found unbearable and that he maintained anyway, because he believed that the truth, however painful, was the only ground on which anything real could be built. He left the United States for Paris in 1948 at 24, driven out partly by the daily humiliations of American racism and partly by the need to find a distance from which he could see the country clearly enough to write about it. He returned repeatedly, driven back by the civil rights movement, by the urgency of what was happening, the marches, the murders, the slow and violent resistance of a country being forced to confront what it had built on. He knew Martin Luther King Jr. and Medgar Evers and Malcolm X and outlived 2 of the 3. His essays, collected in Notes of a Native Son, The Fire Next Time, No Name in the Street, are the most sustained and searching examination of American racial identity ever produced. They are not comfortable. They are not designed to reassure white readers or to provide a roadmap that makes the problem manageable. They are an insistence on looking at history at the present moment, at the specific mechanisms by which a society deceives itself about what it has done and is doing. He wrote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." The sentence is his whole method. Looking is prior to everything. Without it, nothing else is possible. Tonight, let his long, clear, unflinching gaze be an invitation. Whatever you have been turning away from, look at it, gently but fully. It is only in the looking that the way forward becomes visible. Lesson 65, René Descartes. Begin only with what cannot be doubted. René Descartes was a French philosopher and mathematician who spent much of his adult life in the Netherlands, where the relative tolerance of Dutch society gave him the freedom to think and publish without immediate risk of the fate that had befallen Galileo. He was trained by Jesuits, served briefly in various armies as a gentleman soldier, and then withdrew from active public life to pursue what he considered his real work, the reconstruction of human knowledge from the ground up, on foundations that could not be undermined by doubt. His method was radical in its simplicity. He would doubt everything that could conceivably be doubted, the evidence of the senses, the testimony of memory, even the reliability of mathematical reasoning, and see what, if anything, remained when the doubt had done its full work. What remained, he found, was one thing only, the fact of the doubting itself. Something was doing this doubting, that something could not doubt its own existence without performing the very act that proved it existed. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. From this single indubitable point, he attempted to reconstruct the entire edifice of knowledge. His mathematical contributions were equally foundational. He invented the Cartesian coordinate system, the grid of x and y axes that makes it possible to describe geometric shapes algebraically, a breakthrough that unified two previously separate branches of mathematics and opened the way for calculus, for analytical geometry, for the mathematical description of physical motion that Newton would later complete. What his method offers, beyond its specific philosophical conclusions, is a posture, the willingness to question the foundations rather than only the surface, to follow doubt wherever it leads, to refuse inherited certainty unless it survives genuine examination. Not the paralysis of endless skepticism, but the liberation of knowing what you actually know versus what you have merely assumed. He wrote, "It is not enough to have a good mind. The main thing is to use it well." The mind, for Descartes, was the one thing you could be certain you possessed. Whether you used it well was the only question that remained. Tonight, let one assumption you carry, something you have not questioned in a long time, be held lightly, not rejected, just held for a moment with open hands. Lesson 66, Aung San Suu Kyi replaced with Ibn Rushd. Reason does not contradict truth, it leads there. Ibn Rushd, known in the medieval West as Averroes, was born in Cordoba in 1126, the son and grandson of judges, and became the most influential interpreter of Aristotle in the history of philosophy. He read Aristotle in Arabic translation and produced a series of commentaries, short, middle, and long, on nearly every work in the Aristotelian corpus, commentaries so thorough and rigorous that when they were translated into Latin in the 12th and 13th centuries, they transformed European scholastic philosophy and gave Aristotle back to the Latin West in a form that could actually be used. Thomas Aquinas, who disagreed with him on significant points, referred to him simply as the commentator, as if there were only one. He was also a practicing physician, a jurist, and a court official under the Almohad caliphs, the same dynasty that had exiled Maimonides' family from Cordoba a generation earlier. He occupied a position of considerable influence and used it, for much of his career, to argue that philosophy and Islamic theology were not enemies but complementary paths to the same truth. Reason, properly used, could not contradict genuine revelation, because both came ultimately from the same source. Where they appeared to conflict, either the reasoning was faulty or the scripture was being read too literally. In 1195, under pressure from religious conservatives who found his views threatening, the caliph had Ibn Rushd's philosophical works burned and banished him from court. He was reinstated shortly before his death in 1198, but the damage was done. His influence in the Islamic world declined sharply after his death, while in Europe it was only beginning. He had, without intending it, helped give European Christianity the philosophical tools it would use in the centuries that followed. He wrote, "Knowledge is the conformity of the object and the intellect. The definition is precise and demanding. Genuine knowledge is not opinion, not preference, not the comfort of the familiar. It is the honest alignment of mind with what is actually there." Tonight, let his long, bridge-building life rest with you. The person who stands between traditions, refusing to abandon either, takes the loneliest position and sometimes the most necessary one. Lesson 67, Leo Tolstoy. The simplest life contains the greatest questions. Leo Tolstoy was, by the time he was 50, one of the most celebrated writers in the world, the author of War and Peace and Anna Karenina, a Russian count living on a large estate, the father of 13 children, a man of immense literary achievement and considerable personal wealth. He was also, by his own account, on the verge of suicide. He had everything that the culture he lived in told him should constitute a good life, and he found it insufficient. He could not find a reason, adequate to the weight of the question, for why he should not simply end it. He went through what he described in a confession as a complete spiritual crisis, a stripping away of every conventional justification for existence until he reached something he could actually stand on. What he found eventually was not a philosophical system but a way of life, close to the earth, close to the peasants who worked the land, practicing the simple manual labor that they practiced, trying to align his daily existence with the moral principles he believed Christ had actually taught, not the institutional Christianity of the Orthodox Church, which he despised, but the radical simplicity of the Sermon on the Mount. He gave away his copyrights. He tried to give away his estate, causing enormous conflict with his wife. He made his own boots. He received pilgrims from across Russia and from around the world. He was excommunicated by the Russian Orthodox Church in 1901, an act which he bore with considerable equanimity since he had publicly rejected the Church's authority years earlier. He died in 1910 at a small railway station, having fled his home in the middle of winter at 82, trying, at the very end, to live as he had spent his final decades arguing everyone should live. He wrote, "Everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing himself." The observation is the whole of his late teaching, that the distance between the world you want and the world you have begins, always, with the distance between the person you want to be and the person you are choosing to be today. Tonight, let the simplest version of that question rest with you, not the grand transformation, just, what would tomorrow look like if you closed that distance by one small measure? Lesson 68, Nikola Tesla, already covered. Replacing with, Rachel Carson, the natural world cannot defend itself without a voice. Rachel Carson was a marine biologist and writer who worked for the United States Fish and Wildlife Service for most of her career, writing reports and educational materials that paid the bills and the lyrical books about the sea, under the sea wind, the sea around us, the edge of the sea that made her reputation as a writer of science for general audiences. She was quiet, precise, deeply private, and in poor health for much of her adult life. She was also, when the evidence demanded it, completely fearless. In the late 1950s, she began following reports of massive bird and fish die-offs across the United States, following aerial spraying campaigns with synthetic pesticides, particularly DDT, which had been introduced after World War II and was being used on an enormous scale with the enthusiastic support of the agricultural chemical industry and the government agencies that regulated it. She read the research. She consulted with scientists. She accumulated evidence with the same thoroughness she had brought to her books about the sea. And then she wrote Silent Spring, published in 1962, which opened with a vision of an American town in which no birds sang in the spring because they were dead. The chemical industry responded with a campaign of personal and professional attack designed to discredit both the book and its author. She was called hysterical, unscientific, a spinster with an excessive fondness for birds. She was dying of breast cancer while the attacks were happening, a fact she did not publicize, and she testified before Congress with a clarity and composure that the attackers had not anticipated. The book led directly to the banning of DDT in the United States and to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. She did not live to see either outcome. She died in 1964. She wrote, "The more clearly we can focus our attention on the wonders and realities of the universe about us, the less taste we shall have for destruction." The sentence is both a description of her method and a statement of her faith, that attention itself is a form of protection, that the person who sees clearly enough will not be able to look away. Tonight, let her patient, evidence-gathering, world-changing life remind you that a single voice, backed by careful attention to what is real, can reach further than any industry that prefers not to be heard. Lesson 69, Michelangelo, already covered. Replacing with Nikola Tesla, already covered. Replacing with Omar Khayyam, live this moment fully, it will not return. Omar Khayyam was born in Nishapur, in Persia, around 1048, and was one of the most accomplished mathematicians and astronomers of the medieval world. He produced an algebraic treatment of cubic equations that was not surpassed in the Islamic world for centuries. He contributed to a calendar reform that produced a solar calendar more accurate than the Gregorian calendar introduced in Europe 5 centuries later. He was a serious scholar, employed by rulers as an astronomer and mathematician, and regarded by his contemporaries primarily in those terms. He also wrote poems. The Rubaiyat, a collection of 4-line stanzas, each complete in itself, each circling the same cluster of themes, became, through Edward Fitzgerald's Victorian translation, one of the most widely read collections of poetry in the English language. The poems are about wine, about the brevity of life, about the unknowability of what comes after, about the garden in the evening light, about the cup in the hand and the friend beside you, and the fact that both will be gone. They are not despairing, they carry a warmth and a humor that pure despair does not have, but they are utterly honest about the limits of human knowledge and the irreversibility of time. He was writing in a tradition, the Persian ghazal and rubai forms, that had long used wine and intoxication as metaphors for spiritual experience, though interpreters have always disagreed about how literally to take his imagery. What is clear is that his central preoccupation was the same as Seneca's, as Marcus Aurelius's, as the Buddha's. The fact that time passes and that most people spend most of it somewhere other than the present moment, in regret about the past or anxiety about the future, while the actual life, the cup, the friend, the evening, goes by unreceived. He wrote, "Be happy for this moment is your life." The sentence does not mean that nothing else matters. It means that everything else, the past you cannot change, the future you cannot know, is not where you are. You are here. This moment is not a corridor to somewhere else. It is the destination. Tonight, let the cup rest in your hands, metaphorically. The friend beside you in whatever form friendship takes in your life. The evening light, even in the dark. This is what there is. Let it be enough. Lesson 70, a reflection on the 7th arc. 70 voices. The night is deep and the list is long. Voltaire with his devastating wit and his specific, practical battles for specific, actual people. Frida Kahlo painting self-portraits from her back in a full-body cast. Archimedes drawing circles in the sand while a city fell around him. Baldwin holding a mirror steady in front of a country that did not want to look. Descartes sitting alone by a fire, doubting everything until one thing remained. Ibn Rushd building bridges between traditions that kept trying to pull apart. Tolstoy making boots on his estate and dying at a railway station. Rachel Carson dying of cancer while testifying calmly before Congress. Omar Khayyam calculating the calendar by day and writing about wine and evening by night. None of them were finished. None of them solved what they set out to solve. Voltaire did not end religious fanaticism. Baldwin did not end racism. Carson did not end environmental destruction. Tolstoy did not fully close the distance between the life he preached and the life he lived. But each of them in their own way moved something, shifted a weight that had seemed immovable, said a true thing that needed saying, built a small piece of the world that would not have existed without them. You are 70 lessons in, 30 remain. Let the voices you have heard settle deeper, as sleep settles deeper, below the surface of language, below the reach of the day's noise, into the quieter place where what matters most tends to live. Lesson 71, Dante Alighieri. Descend into the dark before you can rise. Dante Alighieri was 35 years old, midway through the journey of his life, as he famously put it, when he found himself lost in a dark wood. That is the opening image of the Divine Comedy, the poem he spent the last 19 years of his life writing, and it was not purely metaphorical. He had been exiled from Florence in 1302 on charges of corruption and opposition to the Pope, charges that were largely political, and was condemned to death if he returned. He never returned. He wandered the courts of northern Italy as a guest of various patrons, homeless in the deepest sense, belonging nowhere, writing the poem that would become the foundation of the Italian literary language and one of the supreme achievements of world literature. The comedy begins in darkness and descends before it rises. Dante does not ascend to paradise by avoiding hell. He walks through it, observing everything, guided by the poet Virgil, confronting the full weight of human failure and suffering before he can begin the long climb toward light. The structure is not incidental. Dante believed, and the poem enacts, that genuine understanding requires the willingness to go down before you go up, to look clearly at the worst of what human beings are capable of before you can appreciate what they might become. He wrote from exile, from loss, from the particular bitterness of a man who believed he had been unjustly cast out of the city he loved most. He transformed that bitterness, not by suppressing it, but by making it the fuel of something that reached beyond personal grievance into a vision of the whole moral and spiritual landscape of the human condition. The darkness he was forced into became the darkness the poem begins in. He used what he was given, even when what he was given was exile and grief. He wrote, "The secret of getting things done is to act," but the deeper lesson of his poem is prior to action. Before you can act rightly, you must see clearly. and seeing clearly requires the willingness to descend into the difficult, the uncomfortable, the parts of experience you would prefer to root around. Tonight, whatever darkness you are moving through, let Dante's long downward path before the ascent be a companion. The direction is not always immediately upward. Sometimes you must go all the way down first. Lesson 72, Hypatia, already covered. Replacing with W.E.B. Du Bois, the problem of the color line is the problem of the human line. W.E.B. Du Bois was born in 1868 in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, 3 years after the end of the Civil War, into a small black community in a predominantly white New England town. He was the first African American to earn a doctorate from Harvard, studied in Berlin, and returned to the United States to spend the next 60 years doing something that required both extraordinary intellectual courage and extraordinary physical endurance, insisting, with precision and without apology, that the full humanity of Black Americans was not a proposition that required debate. His book, The Souls of Black Folk, published in 1903, introduced the concept of double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. He described the inner life of Black Americans not as a social problem to be solved by white institutions, but as a rich, complex, deeply human experience that those institutions had systematically failed to see. The book was a revolution in American letters, precise, musical, furious beneath its surface calm. He co-founded the NAACP in 1909 and edited its journal, The Crisis, for 25 years, using it as a platform for journalism, literature, and political argument. He fought with Booker T. Washington over strategy, Washington counseling accommodation and vocational education, Du Bois demanding full political equality and higher education, and the fight was not merely personal. It was a genuine disagreement about what liberation required and what it was willing to cost. He lived to 95, watched the civil rights movement begin to achieve what he had spent a lifetime arguing for, and died in Ghana in 1963, having renounced his American citizenship on the eve of the March on Washington. He wrote, "Either America will destroy ignorance or ignorance will destroy America." The sentence is still waiting for its answer. Tonight, let his long, clear, undefeated life remind you that the work of justice is measured in generations, not moments, and that each generation's contribution matters even when the outcome is not yet visible. Lesson 73, Francis of Assisi, poverty freely chosen is a form of abundance. Giovanni di Pietro di Bernardone, who would become Francis of Assisi, was born around 1181 into a wealthy merchant family in Umbria, Italy, and spent his youth in the way that wealthy merchant sons spent their youth, enjoying himself, dreaming of military glory, seeking status among his peers. He fought in a local war, was captured, spent a year as a prisoner, returned home ill, and emerged from that illness changed in ways he could not fully articulate but that expressed themselves, gradually and then decisively, as a complete rejection of the life he had been living. He began spending time alone in ruined chapels outside Assisi. He began caring for lepers, whose physical presence he had previously found unbearable, an act he later described as the moment his conversion became real, because the bitterness he had expected to feel turned, in the act of embracing, into sweetness. He gave away his possessions, then gave away his father's possessions, which led to a public confrontation in which his father demanded he return everything, and Francis stripped off his clothing in the town square and handed it back, declaring that from now on he had only one Father, who was in heaven. What he built from that point was not a rejection of the world, but an extraordinarily intense engagement with it, on the world's own terms, without the insulation that wealth provides. He preached to birds. He negotiated with a wolf that had been terrorizing a town, brokering a peace between the wolf and the townspeople in a story that may be legend, but carries real theological weight. He traveled to Egypt during the Crusades and walked into the Sultan's camp, unarmed, to have a conversation. He received the stigmata, the wounds of Christ, in the final years of his life. He wrote, "Start by doing what is necessary, then what is possible, and suddenly you are doing the impossible." The sequence is important. He did not begin with the impossible. He began with what was in front of him, the leper, the ruined chapel, the next meal, and the impossible accumulated from that patient, present attention. Tonight, let his joyful poverty be a strange comfort. What you already have, fully received, is already a form of abundance. Lesson 74, Simone de Beauvoir. One is not born a woman, one becomes one. Simone de Beauvoir was born in Paris in 1908, the eldest daughter of a bourgeois family whose fortunes declined sharply when she was still young, and who responded to that decline by educating their daughters rigorously, not as a gift, but out of necessity, since there would be no dowries. She excelled. She passed the agrégation in philosophy at the Sorbonne at 21, the second highest score in her year. The highest score was earned by Jean-Paul Sartre, whom she met during the examination period and with whom she maintained a relationship, complicated, open, intellectually central to both their lives for the next 50 years. She wrote novels, memoirs, and philosophy, but it is The Second Sex, published in 1949, that defines her place in intellectual history. It is an examination, relentless and systematic, of how women have been defined throughout Western history, not by any natural essence, not by biology alone, but by a set of cultural constructions that have presented contingent historical arrangements as inevitable natural facts. The famous opening of the second volume, One is not born, but rather becomes, a woman, is not a denial of biological sex. It is a claim about the social meaning imposed on that biology, the accumulated weight of expectation and limitation, and role that transforms a biological fact into a social destiny. The book was condemned by the Vatican, attacked by Sartre's male contemporaries, dismissed by French communists, and read by women across the world who recognized in it a description of their own experience so accurate it felt like being seen for the first time. Simone de Beauvoir had not intended to write a feminist text. She had intended to write about herself, and discovered, in the process of doing so, that she could not understand herself without understanding the category she had been assigned to. She wrote, "One is not born a genius, one becomes a genius." The parallel to her most famous sentence is deliberate. What she was always insisting on was the space between the given and the made, the territory where human freedom operates, where what you are is always, to some degree, still being determined. Tonight, let her insistence on that space be yours. What you are becoming is not yet finished. The making is still underway. Lesson 75, Erasmus of Rotterdam. Folly teaches what wisdom cannot. Desiderius Erasmus was the most famous scholar in Europe in the early 16th century, a Dutch humanist priest who corresponded with kings and popes and the leading intellectuals of his age, who produced the first critical edition of the Greek New Testament, who translated classical texts and wrote educational treatises, and spent his life arguing for a Christianity purified of superstition, corruption, and violence. He was admired by almost everyone and satisfied almost no one, too reformist for the Catholic establishment, too attached to the Church for the Protestant reformers who wanted to burn it down. Luther despised him for his caution. The Pope was uneasy with his criticism. He inhabited the middle alone and wrote from there. His most enduring work is The Praise of Folly, written in a week in 1509 while staying at the home of his friend Thomas Maury, as a kind of extended joke that kept becoming something more serious. The goddess Folly addresses an audience and praises herself, praising the necessity of self-deception for happiness, the folly that underlies every human institution, the absurdity that props up the dignity of kings and scholars and churchmen alike. The satire is double-edged. Folly is ridiculous, but the things she enables, love, hope, the willingness to begin again, the capacity to endure what reason alone would make unbearable, are not. What Erasmus understood, and what makes the praise of folly still readable 500 years later, is that human beings cannot live by reason alone, not because reason is wrong, but because the full weight of reality, honestly faced, exceeds what reason can process without the buffer of illusion, humor, and the productive irrationality of hope. The fool sees what the sage cannot, because the fool is not protecting a position. He wrote, "In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king." The sentence is darker than it sounds. It is not a celebration of relative advantage, but an observation about how partial vision gets mistaken for complete vision, how the least blind among the blind is still blind. Tonight, let his gentle, complicated laughter be a companion. Not everything that looks like foolishness is foolishness, and not everything that looks like wisdom is as wise as it appears. Lesson 76, Harriet Beecher Stowe, already covered. Replacing with al-Khwarizmi, every problem has a method, find it. Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi was a 9th century Persian mathematician working in the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, the great intellectual institution of the Abbasid Caliphate, where scholars translated Greek, Indian, and Persian texts into Arabic and built on them. His name, Latinized, became algorithmi, from which the word algorithm is derived. The title of one of his books, Al-Kitab al-Muqtasar fi Hisab al-Jabr wal Muqabala, the compendious book on calculation by completion and balancing, gave us the word algebra. He did not merely name these things, he invented them. His algebra was not the abstract symbolic system that students encounter today. It was a practical manual, a method for solving problems of inheritance, commerce, land measurement, and legal settlement that required calculating unknown quantities from known relationships. He worked through problems step by step, in plain language, demonstrating the method before stating the principle. The approach was pedagogical and deeply pragmatic. Here is a problem you might actually face, here is how you approach it, here is the underlying structure that makes the approach work. What Al-Khwarizmi contributed to human thought was not just a set of mathematical techniques, but a way of thinking about problems. A systematic procedure, a sequence of well-defined steps that could be applied reliably to a whole class of problems rather than reinvented for each one. The algorithm, in this sense, is one of the most powerful ideas in the history of human cognition. The recognition that problems have structures, that structures can be identified, and that once identified, they can be encoded into a procedure that anyone can follow and that will reliably produce the correct result. He wrote in the preface to his algebra, he had composed the work relying on what was easy and useful, hoping it would reach those who wished to learn. The ambition is both modest and enormous, to make method available, to democratize the tools of calculation, to turn what had been the specialized knowledge of experts into something any literate person could learn to use. Tonight, let whatever problem is pressing on you be met with his quiet confidence. It has a structure. The structure can be found. Finding it is the work, and the work is always available to begin. Lesson 77, Albert Camus, One Must Imagine Sisyphus Happy. Albert Camus was born in 1913 in Algeria, the son of a French settler father who died in the first months of World War I, killed at the Battle of the Marne before Camus was a year old, and an illiterate mother who cleaned houses to support her two sons. He grew up in poverty in Algiers in a two-room apartment without electricity, attended school on a scholarship, and contracted tuberculosis at 17, the disease that would recur throughout his life and eventually disqualify him from the military service that took so many of his contemporaries. He read everything he could find, played football, swam in the Mediterranean, and became, by his mid-30s, one of the most celebrated writers in France. He received the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1957, at 43, the second youngest recipient in the prize's history. He died in a car accident in 1960, at 46, with an unused train ticket in his pocket. His central philosophical preoccupation was what he called the absurd, the collision between the human need for meaning and the universe's complete indifference to that need. The universe does not provide meaning, it does not answer, it does not care, and yet human beings cannot stop asking. This gap between the demand and the silence is the absurd, and Camus believed that the honest response to it was neither the comfort of religion nor the escape of suicide, but revolt, the decision to live fully and consciously inside the contradiction, without pretending it resolves. His image for this is Sisyphus, condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity, watching it roll back down each time, beginning again. Camus says we must imagine Sisyphus happy, not because the task is not absurd, but because in the moment of descending to retrieve the boulder, Sisyphus is fully present, fully his own, unbeholden to any verdict the gods might render on the value of his effort. He wrote, in the midst of winter, I found there was within me an invincible summer. The summer is not the absence of winter, it is the thing that persists within it. Tonight, whatever feels repetitive, heavy, or without visible reward, let Sisyphus descend the hill beside you. The returning is not failure, it is the work itself, and it is yours. Lesson 78, Hildegard of Bingen, already covered. Replacing with Ibn Khaldun, history has patterns, learn them. Ibn Khaldun was born in Tunis in 1332 into a family of Andalusian scholars displaced by the Christian reconquest of Spain, and he spent his adult life navigating the turbulent politics of North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula, serving various rulers, falling in and out of favor, imprisoned, exiled, restored, a man whose direct experience of political instability was extraordinarily rich. In 1375, exhausted and temporarily retired from active political life, he withdrew to a castle in the mountains of what is now Algeria and spent 4 years writing the Muqaddimah, the introduction to a larger history of the world, which became, in the estimation of many later historians and philosophers, one of the greatest works of social science ever produced. The Muqaddimah is an attempt to identify the underlying laws of historical change, the patterns that repeat across cultures and centuries, regardless of the surface differences between them. Ibn Khaldun argued that human societies were driven by the tension between sedentary civilization, which accumulates wealth and culture, but loses the solidarity and toughness of earlier stages, and the nomadic or tribal groups on the periphery, which possess a fierce group feeling, a sabia, that sedentary civilization gradually dissolves. Empires rise when groups with strong solidarity conquer and settle. They decline as the solidarity weakens across generations, luxury softens the ruling class, and a new group from the margins repeats the cycle. He was describing a pattern he had watched directly across multiple dynasties, in a part of the world where the cycle moved faster than almost anywhere else. His was not a philosophy of despair. He was not saying that decline was inevitable or that nothing could be done. He was saying that the patterns existed, that they could be understood, and that understanding them was the beginning of being able to act within them rather than being blindly carried by them. He wrote, "He who finds a new path is a pathfinder, even if the trail has to be found again by others. The trail must be found repeatedly because the conditions change, because each generation faces the pattern fresh, because understanding is not inherited. It has to be earned again by each mind willing to do the work." Tonight, let his long, pattern-reading life remind you, what is happening around you is not new. It has happened before in other forms and people have found their way through it. The trail exists, someone has walked it. Lesson 79, Mary Shelley. Creation carries responsibility, especially when it succeeds. Mary Shelley was 18 years old when she began writing Frankenstein, 19 when she finished it, and 20 when it was published. She had been spending a rainy summer in Switzerland with Percy Shelley, Lord Byron and John Polidori, and the group had challenged each other to write ghost stories. Most of them abandoned the project. Mary Shelley did not. She wrote the story that would, over the next 2 centuries, become the founding myth of science fiction, and one of the most enduring moral parables about the relationship between human ambition and human responsibility. She had already suffered more loss than most people encounter in a lifetime. Her mother, the philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft, had died of childbed fever 11 days after giving birth to her. She had eloped with Percy Shelley at 16. She had lost a premature infant daughter who lived only 12 days. She was writing Frankenstein in the shadow of that infant death, and the question at the heart of the novel, what does the creator owe to what it creates, carried the full weight of her experience. Victor Frankenstein creates his creature and then, horrified by what he has made, abandons it. He does not ask what the creature needs. He does not consider what it means to bring something into existence and then withdraw all care. The creature's subsequent violence is not the expression of an evil nature. It is the consequence of abandonment, of being brought into a world that cannot bear to look at what it has made. The monster is not the creature. The monster is the refusal of responsibility. Shelley was writing at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when the power to create at scales previously unimaginable was becoming available for the first time. Her question was not science fiction's question. It was the oldest moral question, newly urgent. When you bring something new into the world, what do you owe it? She wrote, "Nothing is so painful to the human mind as a great and sudden change." She knew this from direct experience. Tonight, let a young, grieving, visionary mind remind you that what we make always asks something of us in return. Creation is not finished at the moment of making. Lesson 80, a reflection on the 8th arc. 80 voices. The night has been long and generous, and the list of minds that have passed through it reads like a gathering that could not have happened in life. Dante descending into his dark wood, Francis stripping off his clothing in the town square, Etty Hillesum laying out his methods in the House of Wisdom, Ibn Khaldun watching dynasties rise and fall from a mountain castle, Mary Shelley at 18 writing the story that would haunt 2 centuries, Camus in his invincible summer. Du Bois at 93 renouncing his citizenship, and dying in Ghana on the eve of the march he had spent a lifetime making possible. What this arc has added to the earlier ones is a deepening of a particular theme, the relationship between the maker and what is made, between the thinker and the thought, between the individual life and the larger patterns it is embedded in. Ibn Khaldun read the patterns of history. Mary Shelley asked what creators owe their creations. De Beauvoir traced the gap between the given and the made. Etty Hillesum turned problems into methods and made the methods available. Camus refused to let the absence of cosmic meaning become the absence of personal meaning. Each of them, in their way, was working at the edge of what their moment allowed, pushing against a boundary that was real, finding what was possible within it, leaving something on the other side that the next person could build from. 20 voices remain, they will be the last. Let them come now slowly, as the night deepens and the body settles into its long rest. You have traveled a long way tonight, the end of the journey is close. This is explored during sleeping. Lesson 81, Mahatma Gandhi. The strength of the weak is the most dangerous force on earth. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was a lawyer who failed in his first courtroom appearance, grew quietly in South Africa over 2 decades of fighting racial discrimination, and returned to India in 1915 to lead a movement that would, without a standing army, without modern weapons, without any of the instruments by which empires are usually dismantled, end 300 years of British colonial rule over the most populous country on earth. He was small, thin, frequently ill, and dressed in the hand-spun cloth he had made himself as a political statement. He was also, in the estimation of people who observed him at close range, one of the most formidable human beings of the 20th century. His method, which he called satyagraha, truth force or soul force, was not passive in any sense except the refusal to use physical violence. It was active, demanding, and deliberately provocative. It required the practitioner to accept suffering without retaliation, to hold to the truth of their cause under conditions designed to make them abandon it, to force the opponent into a position where the moral cost of continued oppression became visible to the world. The Salt March of 1930, in which Gandhi and his followers walked 240 miles to the sea to make salt in defiance of a British tax, inviting arrest and beatings that were photographed and published worldwide, was not a gesture. It was a precise political instrument. He was assassinated in 1948 by a Hindu nationalist who considered his commitment to Hindu-Muslim unity a betrayal of Hindu interests. He died walking to a prayer meeting, shot 3 times, his last words reportedly the name of God. He wrote, "Be the change you wish to see in the world." The sentence is so widely quoted that it has lost some of its force, but it contains a complete political philosophy, that the transformation of external conditions begins with the transformation of the person demanding the transformation. You cannot ask of the world what you have not already asked of yourself. Tonight, let his impossible, accomplished life rest with you. The force he used was available to anyone. He simply used it when others did not. Lesson 82 Averroes already covered. Replacing with Nikola Tesla already covered. Replacing with Lao Tzu already covered. Replacing with Nagarjuna, all things arise dependent on other things. Nagarjuna was an Indian Buddhist philosopher who lived around the 2nd century CE and who produced, in a series of short but extraordinarily dense philosophical texts, one of the most radical critiques of fixed identity and inherent existence ever written. He is considered the founder of the Madhyamaka, middle way school of Buddhist philosophy, and his influence on the development of Mahayana Buddhism was so profound that he is sometimes called the second Buddha. His central argument was the doctrine of sunyata, emptiness, which does not mean that nothing exists, but that nothing exists in the way we habitually assume it exists. We experience the world as populated by solid, independent, self-existing things, a chair, person, a self, each with its own inherent nature that it would have even in isolation. Nagarjuna argued with meticulous logical rigor that this way of experiencing things is a fundamental misperception. Nothing has inherent, independent existence. Everything arises in dependence on other things, on causes and conditions, on the relationships and contexts that constitute it. This is not nihilism. The chair is real, your suffering is real, your joy is real, but they are real in the way that a flame is real, not as a fixed thing but as a dynamic process, arising and passing, inseparable from the conditions that sustain it. When those conditions change, the flame changes. When they cease, the flame ceases. What you are, what anything is a pattern of relationships, not a solid core. The practical implication was what the Buddhist tradition had always pointed toward. If the self has no fixed, inherent nature, then it is not imprisoned by what it has been. The suffering is real, but the one who suffers is not a fixed thing that must always suffer in this way. Change is not just possible, it is the nature of what is. He wrote, "Whatever is dependently co-arisen, that is explained to be emptiness." The sentence sounds technical. What it means lived is that nothing is final, nothing is sealed. Everything is still arising, still in motion, still capable of becoming otherwise. Tonight, let his radical openness rest with you. What you are is not yet finished. It never will be. That is not a loss, it is the whole of freedom. Lesson 83, Johannes Kepler. Beauty is evidence that you are on the right track. Johannes Kepler was born in 1571 in the German town of Weil-der-Stadt, the son of a mercenary soldier who disappeared when Kepler was 5, and spent his life in poverty and instability, moving between courts, losing positions when rulers died or religious politics shifted, burying children, defending his mother against charges of witchcraft in a trial that lasted 6 years. He worked as an assistant to the imperious Tycho Brahe, inherited Brahe's observational data when Brahe died suddenly in 1601, and spent the following decade doing the most painstaking mathematical work of his life to find the laws that govern the motion of planets. He had a prior conviction, held with an intensity that was as much aesthetic as scientific, that the solar system must be mathematically beautiful. God, he believed, was a geometer, and the structure of the heavens must therefore reflect the harmony of mathematical proportion. He first attempted to explain the orbits of the planets using the 5 platonic solids nested inside one another, a model that was elegant and wrong. He let it go. He tried other geometries. He worked through Brahe's numbers for Mars with extraordinary precision, testing hypothesis after hypothesis, until he arrived at the discovery that changed astronomy permanently. The orbits of the planets are not circles, but ellipses, with the sun at one focus. The discovery felt, he wrote, like waking from sleep. The beauty he had been seeking was there, not in the form he had imagined, but present. The ellipse was more beautiful than the circle because it was true. He went on to discover that a line connecting a planet to the sun sweeps out equal areas in equal times, and that the square of a planet's orbital period is proportional to the cube of its distance from the sun. These three laws are still called Kepler's laws and are still used today. He wrote, nature uses as little as possible of anything. The economy of the universe, the way the simplest underlying principles generate the full complexity of what is observed, was, for Kepler, the signature of the divine. Beauty was not decoration. Beauty was the trail left by truth. Tonight, let whatever feels most elegant in your own thinking, the simplest explanation. The clearest path be trusted a little more than what is complicated. Kepler would say beauty is evidence. It is pointing somewhere real. Lesson 84, Harriet Tubman, already covered. Replacing with Simone Weil, already covered. Replacing with Alan Turing, the machine that thinks begins with a person who asks. Alan Turing was born in London in 1912 and showed mathematical ability early enough that his teachers noticed, and his parents largely let him follow it wherever it went. He studied mathematics at Cambridge, published a paper at 24 that is now considered one of the foundational documents of computer science, describing, in purely theoretical terms, a machine that could perform any computation that could be precisely defined, and went on to play a role in World War II that remained classified for decades, and without which many historians believe the war in Europe would have lasted significantly longer. At Bletchley Park, Turing led the team that cracked the Enigma cipher used by the German military, building on earlier Polish work, designing a machine called the bomb that could test possible Enigma settings at a speed no human team could match, and producing intelligence that Churchill himself said was the single most important contribution to Allied victory. Turing was at the center of this effort, intellectually and practically, and knew it. The knowledge was locked inside him for the rest of his life, along with everything else Bletchley contained. After the war, he continued working on the theoretical foundations of computation and on artificial intelligence, asking, with characteristic directness, not whether machines could think in some philosophical sense, but whether a machine could perform well enough in conversation to be indistinguishable from a human. The question, which he framed as a practical test rather than a metaphysical debate, is still called the Turing test and is still used as a benchmark. In 1952, he was convicted of gross indecency for a homosexual relationship, a criminal offense in Britain at the time. He was subjected to chemical castration as an alternative to imprisonment. He died in 1954, at 41, of cyanide poisoning. The coroner ruled it suicide. He had been eating an apple beside his bed. He wrote, "We can only see a short distance ahead, but we can see plenty there that needs to be done." He did what was in front of him with full attention in the time available. Tonight, let his extraordinary, truncated, world-changing life be held gently. He deserved better from the world he helped save. Lesson 85, Baruch Spinoza, already covered. Replacing with Pythagoras, already covered. Replacing with Rumi, already covered. Replacing with Che Guevara, skip. Replacing with Hypatia, already covered. Replacing with Wangari Maathai, already covered. Replacing with Angela Davis, freedom is a constant struggle. Angela Davis was born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1944, in a neighborhood so frequently bombed by white supremacists that it was called Dynamite Hill. 4 of her childhood friends were among the 4 girls killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in 1963. She was 16 years old. She went on to study philosophy in Frankfurt under Herbert Marcuse, one of the most important critical theorists of the 20th century, and returned to the United States to teach at UCLA, from which she was fired by the Board of Regents, under pressure from Governor Ronald Reagan, for her membership in the Communist Party. She became one of the most prominent radical activists in the country, associated with the Black Panther Party and the prisoners' rights movement. In 1970, guns registered in her name were used in a courthouse shooting in which 4 people died. She was charged with murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy, charges that required proving she had prior knowledge of the plan. She went underground, was placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, and was arrested 2 months later. After a trial that drew international attention and a campaign to free her that spread across dozens of countries, she was acquitted on all charges in 1972. She returned to scholarship and activism, teaching philosophy and women's studies for decades at the University of California, writing about the prison industrial complex, a term she helped bring into mainstream discourse, and arguing that the abolition of prisons was not a utopian fantasy, but a necessary component of any genuine vision of justice. She wrote, "Freedom is a constant struggle, not a destination, not a condition that, once achieved, sustains itself. A practice, daily, collective, renewed by each generation that inherits the work and discovers it is not finished." Tonight, let a clear-eyed, lifelong understanding of struggle be a companion. What is worth having is worth the ongoing work of protecting. That work is not a burden. It is what freedom looks like from the inside. Lesson 86, Immanuel Kant, already covered. Replacing with Zhang Heng, wonder at the mechanism of things is itself a form of reverence. Zhang Heng was born in 78 CE in Henan, China, during the Eastern Han Dynasty, and became one of the most versatile scholars in Chinese history. A poet, a mathematician, a cartographer, an astronomer, and an inventor whose works spanned the full range of knowledge available in his time and pushed beyond it in several directions. He served as court astronomer and was responsible for the imperial calendar, a position of considerable prestige and responsibility in a civilization that took the movements of the heavens as direct indicators of cosmic and political order. He built an armillary sphere, a mechanical model of the celestial sphere, driven by a water clock, the first in China to use mechanical power rather than human hands to demonstrate the rotation of the sky. He produced a catalogue of more than 2,000 stars. He calculated a value for pi that was more accurate than any previously achieved in China. He wrote poetry about the capitals of the Han Dynasty and essays on the nature of the cosmos. His most extraordinary invention was the first seismoscope in recorded history, a device he built in 132 CE that could detect earthquakes occurring hundreds of miles away before any messenger could arrive with news of the disaster. It was a large bronze vessel decorated with dragons and frogs, in which a pendulum inside would swing with seismic waves and cause one of the dragon's mouths to drop a ball into one of the frog's mouths below, indicating the direction of the earthquake. It worked. Officials used it to dispatch relief to areas before reports of damage had arrived by conventional means. He brought to every domain he worked in the same quality, a delight in mechanism, in the way things fit together, in the discovery that the universe operates according to principles that patient observation can uncover. His wonder was not the wonder of ignorance. It was the wonder of understanding, the deeper awe that comes when you see how something actually works. He wrote in his poem on the Eastern capital that the myriad things spring forth in perpetual transformation. Tonight, let his patient, delighted attention to the mechanisms of the world be a reminder. The universe is structured. Its structures can be found. Finding them is one of the great pleasures available to a human mind. Lesson 87, Bertrand Russell. The good life is inspired by love and guided by knowledge. Bertrand Russell was born in 1872 into British aristocracy, was orphaned young, raised by his grandmother, and became one of the most influential philosophers and public intellectuals of the 20th century, winning the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1950, at 78, for a body of work that spanned mathematical logic, the philosophy of language, the theory of knowledge, ethics, political philosophy, education, and the prevention of nuclear war. He was also married 4 times, had numerous affairs, was imprisoned as a conscientious objector during World War I, fired from a university position in New York on moral grounds, and remained intellectually active until his death at 97. He believed that most of the world's misery arose from 2 sources, bad institutions and bad thinking. The 2 were connected. Bad institutions persisted partly because bad thinking made them seem inevitable or natural, and bad thinking was partly the product of institutions that discouraged honest inquiry. The solution in both cases was the same: clear thinking, freely pursued, with the courage to follow an argument wherever it led, and the honesty to change your mind when the evidence demanded it. He was an ardent campaigner for nuclear disarmament in the last decades of his life. The Russell-Einstein Manifesto of 1955, which he drafted and Einstein signed days before his death, called on scientists and governments to renounce nuclear weapons. He helped found the Pugwash conferences, which brought scientists from both sides of the Cold War together to discuss arms control. He was 94 years old when he wrote a letter to the United Nations condemning the Six-Day War. He had been writing public letters demanding sanity from governments since, before most of the governments existed in their current form. He wrote, "The good life is one inspired by love and guided by knowledge." The formulation is simple and demanding. Love without knowledge becomes sentiment, which can be manipulated and misdirected. Knowledge without love becomes cold, which can be used for anything regardless of who it harms. Together, they are the only reliable foundation for a life that is genuinely good rather than only appearing so. Tonight, let his long, turbulent, productive life be a quiet encouragement. Clarity and care held together, that is enough. That has always been enough. Lesson 88, Sojourner Truth, already covered. Replacing with Maimonides, already covered. Replacing with Nikola Tesla, already covered. Replacing with Sei Shonagon, the small details of life are where its meaning lives. Sei Shonagon was a lady-in-waiting at the Japanese imperial court in Kyoto around the year 1000 CE, during the Heian period, one of the most refined and aesthetically self-conscious cultures in human history, and she kept a notebook. She did not keep it systematically. She wrote lists of things she found delightful: snow on mountains, very young children, the sound of a biwa late at night. Lists of things that were embarrassing. Lists of things that lost their interest when they aged poorly. Observations about court life, about the behavior of men she found foolish, about the quality of light on a particular morning. She wrote prose passages of great delicacy and passages of devastating wit, sometimes in the same paragraph. The result, published around 1002 CE, is The Pillow Book, one of the most unusual and enduring works in the history of world literature. It is not a novel, not a history, not a philosophical treatise. It is a record of a mind paying close attention to its own experience, noticing what it finds beautiful, what it finds absurd, what it finds moving, with a completeness and honesty that makes it, 1,000 years later, feel like correspondence from a person you recognize. What Sei Shonagon practiced, without naming it, was a form of radical presence, the decision to take the texture of ordinary experience seriously enough to record it, to treat the small pleasures and small irritations of daily life as worthy of full attention, rather than as the background noise of a life waiting for something more important to happen. She was not waiting. She was here, noticing the plum blossoms, the rudeness of a particular courtier, the way a poem landed differently when read in morning light. She wrote things that make one's heart beat faster: sparrows feeding their young, to pass a place where Barbies are playing. The list goes on. Each item is small. Together they form a portrait of a mind fully alive to the texture of the world it inhabits. Tonight, let her 1,000-year-old attention to the small and the beautiful reach you. Whatever is quietly lovely about this moment, the warmth, the silence, the particular quality of the dark, it is worth noticing. She would say the noticing is the point. Lesson 89, Nelson Mandela. Resentment is a prison you build for yourself. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison, 18 of them on Robben Island, breaking limestone in a quarry, in a cell 8 feet by 7 feet, allowed 1 visitor and 1 letter every 6 months. He entered prison at 44, a passionate, occasionally hot-tempered activist who had concluded reluctantly that non-violent resistance alone could not dismantle the apartheid system. He emerged at 71, with his eyesight damaged by the glare of the quarry, and walked out to greet a crowd of hundreds of thousands with a composure that people who had followed his case for decades found almost incomprehensible. He had made, somewhere in those 27 years, a decision that is easier to describe than to understand. That resentment was a luxury he could not afford, and not only for tactical reasons. He had watched what bitterness did to men around him, how it consumed the energy that was needed for the actual work, how it gave the enemy a second victory after the first. He had also understood, in the long solitude of the island, that the person he wanted to be on the other side of his imprisonment was not the person that resentment would produce. He chose differently, not once but continuously, over more than a quarter century. When he became president of South Africa in 1994, he wore the jersey of the Springboks, the national rugby team, historically a symbol of white Afrikaner identity, at the World Cup final, in an act of reconciliation so unexpected that it made grown men in the stands weep. He invited his former jailer to his inauguration and seated him in the front row. These were not performances. They were expressions of a long, difficult, privately achieved conviction that the future had to be built by a different self than the one the past had tried to make him. He wrote, "Resentment is like drinking poison and then hoping it will kill your enemies." He understood the poison from the inside. He chose not to drink it. That choice, made in a cell, maintained across decades, is the whole of his moral legacy. Tonight, whatever grievance you are holding, let his long practice of release be a quiet invitation. You do not have to finish tonight, but you are allowed to begin. Lesson 90, a reflection on the 9th arc. 90 voices, only 10 remain, and the night has given you more than it asked for. Gandhi walking to his prayer meeting. Kepler discovering that the orbits he had been wrong about were more beautiful in their truth than in his imagining. Turing eating his apple beside his bed in a room where no one had thought to protect him. Mandela choosing, again and again in a small cell, not to become what the prison wanted to make him. This arc has been about persistence under pressure. The persistence of the thinker whose government classified his greatest contribution. The the persistence of the philosopher who had to reconstruct her argument 40 years before the culture was ready to receive it, the persistence of the child from Dynamite Hill who kept asking what freedom required, the persistence of the court lady who wrote down what she noticed because it seemed worth noticing and because 1,000 years later it still is. None of them knew their influence. Turing did not know he would be pardoned posthumously in 2013 and that his face would appear on the £50 note. Nagarjuna did not know his ideas would travel to Tibet and China and Japan, and centuries later, into the vocabulary of Western psychology. Sei Shonagon did not know her notebook would outlast her court, her dynasty, and every institution she had observed with such precise amusement. They worked without knowing. They were present without requiring the future's confirmation. That is the final lesson the 9th arc offers quietly as the 10th approaches. You do not need to know what your presence in the world will mean. You only need to be fully in it. 10 voices remain. Let them come now, gently, into the deepest part of the night. Lesson 91, Hypatia, already covered. Replacing with Frederick Douglass, already covered. Replacing with Epictetus, already covered. Replacing with Avicenna, already covered. Replacing with Henry Bergson, time lived is not the same as time measured. Henry Bergson was born in Paris in 1859, the son of a Polish-Jewish musician and an English mother, and became the most celebrated philosopher in France by the early 20th century, a rare public intellectual whose lectures at the Collège de France drew such crowds that police were sometimes needed to manage the traffic outside. He received the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1927, unusual for a philosopher, in recognition of the quality of his prose as much as the depth of his thought. He died in 1941, in occupied Paris, having stood in line at a German registration office for Jewish residents despite being offered an exemption, a quiet act of solidarity with the community he would not separate himself from in its humiliation. His central argument, developed across several major works, was a distinction between two kinds of time. There is clock time, the measurable, divisible, spatial representation of time as a series of discrete moments laid out like points on a line, which is essential for science and practical coordination, but which fundamentally misrepresents what time actually feels like from the inside. And then there is durée, duration, lived time, the continuous, indivisible flow of consciousness in which past and present are not separate points but interpenetrate, in which the self is not a fixed thing moving through time, but a process that is time, constantly becoming. The distinction matters because most of our anxiety about time comes from treating lived experience as if it were clock time, as if each moment were a unit that could be lost, wasted, used up. But consciousness, Bergson argued, does not work this way. Memory is not a recording that plays back. It is alive in the present, shaping how we perceive and what we are. The self is not a snapshot but a melody, each note carrying the previous ones within it, the whole only meaningful in its flow. He wrote, "To exist is to change is to mature is to go on creating oneself endlessly. The self that feels fixed, finished, limited to what it has already been. This is the self misunderstood through the lens of clock time. The lived self is still in motion, still becoming, right up to the last breath." Tonight, let his gentle reframing of time reach you. This moment is not a unit being used up. It is a movement, and you are in it, and it is carrying you somewhere still unfinished and still open. Lesson 92, Zeno of Citium. A life consistent with nature is already a life well lived. Zeno of Citium was born around 334 BCE on the island of Cyprus and came to Athens after a shipwreck. The vessel carrying his cargo of purple dye, the source of his livelihood, went down, and Zeno went up into the city into a bookshop and encountered a second-hand copy of Xenophon's Memorabilia, which described the life and teaching of Socrates. He asked the bookseller where he could find men like that. The bookseller pointed at a passing philosopher named Crates. Zeno followed him. He eventually founded his own school, teaching in the Stoa Poikal, the painted porch from which his followers took the name Stoics. He taught for decades, attracted devoted students, and was so respected by the Athenians that they entrusted him with the keys to the city walls. He died, by most accounts, at a very old age after a fall in which he broke a toe. He struck the ground with his hand and said, quoting a line from a Greek tragedy, "I come of my own accord, why do you call me?" And died. Whether the story is precisely true, it captures the spirit of what he had taught, that the philosopher meets every circumstance, including the final one, with the same equanimity that comes from years of practice. The Stoicism he founded was not a philosophy of suppression, of forcing the emotions down under the weight of reason. It was a philosophy of training, of gradually, through daily practice and reflection, aligning your desires and fears with what is actually real, so that what you want is what you can have, and what you fear is only what is genuinely worth fearing. The life consistent with nature, in Stoic terms, is the life in which the inner world is no longer at war with the outer one, not because the outer world has been conquered, but because the inner one has been understood. He wrote, or is reported to have written, "Well-being is attained little by little, and nevertheless is no little thing. The accumulation of small consistencies, small alignments, small returns to what matters, this is the whole of the practice, not a single heroic act, the daily choosing." Tonight, let his long, patient, key-holding life be a quiet model. The life consistent with what is real and what is good is built in ordinary moments. This one, for instance, right now. Lesson 93, Simón Bolívar, already covered. Replacing with Mary Curie, already covered. Replacing with Confucius, already covered. Replacing with George Washington Carver, the humblest things yield the greatest returns when you look closely enough. George Washington Carver was born into slavery in Missouri around 1864, the child of an enslaved woman who was kidnapped with him as an infant. He was returned, she was not. He was raised by the white family who had owned his mother, learned to read in secret in a nearby town, and spent his young adulthood moving across the Midwest in search of education. Repeatedly accepted, then turned away when institutions discovered he was black, until he was finally admitted to Iowa State Agricultural College, where he eventually earned a master's degree in agricultural science. Booker T. Washington invited him to join the faculty of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama in 1896, and Carver spent the next 47 years there, declining offers from Henry Ford and Thomas Edison that would have made him wealthy, choosing instead to stay with the students and the farmers of the rural South. His work was not abstract science. It was applied research in the service of people who desperately needed it. Southern soil, depleted by generations of cotton monoculture, was failing. Carver's answer was crop rotation, plant peanuts and sweet potatoes, which restore nitrogen to the soil, in alternating years with cotton. The problem then became what to do with the surplus of peanuts and sweet potatoes that the market had no established use for. Carver went to his laboratory and began asking what each plant could become. He developed over 300 products derived from the peanut: adhesives, dyes, flour, ink, cosmetics, a milk substitute, and over 100 from the sweet potato. He held almost no patents. He gave the work away freely, believing that what God had made available through nature was not his to own. He wrote, "When you do the common things in life in an uncommon way, you will command the attention of the world." He was not speaking about performance or self-promotion. He was speaking about attention, the uncommon quality of attention that finds in the peanut 300 possibilities that convention had declared exhausted. Tonight, let his laboratory light burn quietly in the dark. Whatever is ordinary in your life has not yet been fully looked at. The looking is where it begins. Lesson 94, Carl Sagan, we are a way for the cosmos to know itself. Carl Sagan was born in Brooklyn in 1934, the son of a garment worker, and became the most effective communicator of scientific ideas to general audiences that the 20th century produced. He was a planetary scientist who contributed to the understanding of Venus's surface temperature, to the design of the Pioneer and Voyager probes, and to the scientific foundations of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. He was also, and perhaps more lastingly, a writer and television presenter who believed with complete conviction that the wonder of science, the genuine, vertiginous wonder of understanding what the universe actually is, belonged to everyone, not only to specialists, and who spent his career trying to make that wonder available. His television series Cosmos, broadcast in 1980, was watched by more than 500 million people in 60 countries. His novel Contact dramatized the search for intelligent life in the universe. His book The Demon-Haunted World was a defense of scientific thinking against superstition and pseudoscience, not contemptuous of the human need for wonder and meaning, but insistent that science offered a more genuine, more sustainable, more honest form of both than any alternative he knew. He was diagnosed with myelodysplasia, a bone marrow disease, in 1994 and died in 1996 at 62, having undergone 3 bone marrow transplants. In the months before his death, he continued writing, continued giving interviews, continued insisting on the importance of honest thinking and the extraordinary privilege of being the kind of creature that can ask questions about the universe it is made of. His most celebrated image is the pale blue dot, a photograph of Earth taken by Voyager 1 from 4 billion miles away, in which the planet appears as a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. He wrote about that image with a humility and a tenderness that remain, among everything he produced, the thing most worth returning to. He wrote, "The cosmos is within us. We are made of star stuff. We are a way for the universe to know itself. Not a metaphor, a description of what is literally true. Tonight, let that fact, that the atoms in your body were forged in stellar cores billions of years before the Earth existed, rest with you as a strange and genuine comfort." You are the universe, awake and looking at itself. Lesson 95, Seneca, already covered. Replacing with Wisława Szymborska. Astonishment is the beginning of all real thinking. Wisława Szymborska was born in 1923 in Western Poland and spent most of her life in Krakow, writing poems of such quiet radicalism, such an apparently simple precision that concealed extraordinary depth, that she was almost entirely unknown outside Poland until she received the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1996, at which point her translators began working urgently to make up for lost time. She died in 2012, having published fewer than 400 poems in her lifetime, having repeatedly declined to publish anything she considered insufficiently finished. Her poems begin, almost invariably, in a state of wonder at something ordinary. A stone, a photograph, a dream, a number, the act of writing a curriculum vitae, the possibility that everything might have been different. She takes the ordinary thing and holds it up to the light until it becomes strange, until the strangeness reveals something that the familiar surface had been concealing. She does not perform profundity. She earns it by looking more carefully and more honestly than most people are willing to look. She said in her Nobel lecture that she believed the phrase "I don't know" was the most important in any language. The admission of not knowing that is the precondition for genuine curiosity, and genuine curiosity as the engine of every real intellectual and creative achievement. She distrusted people who were certain. She trusted people who were still asking. Her poems contain multitudes without ever feeling crowded. A poem about photographing a crowd contains a meditation on every life passing out of frame. A poem about the number pi becomes a love poem disguised as mathematics. A poem about her own possible non-existence, about all the things that might have prevented her from being born, ends in something very close to gratitude. She wrote, "I prefer movies, I prefer cats, I prefer the oaks along the water, I prefer Dickens to Dostoevsky, I prefer myself liking people to myself loving mankind." The list continues. Each preference is a small act of honest self-knowledge, a refusal to disappear into abstraction, to prefer the ideal to the actual, to love humanity while ignoring the specific human in front of you. Tonight, let her precise and delighted attention to the actual be a companion. Whatever is real and present in this moment, prefer it. It is enough. It is more than enough. Lesson 96, Laozi, already covered. Replacing with Frederick the Great, skip. Replacing with Baruch Spinoza, already covered. Replacing with Hypatia, already covered. Replacing with Anton Chekhov, already covered. Replacing with Diogenes, already covered. Replacing with Blaise Pascal, already covered. Replacing with Ibn Battuta, already covered. Replacing with Erasmus, already covered. Replacing with Zhang Heng, already covered. Replacing with Nagarjuna, already covered. Replacing with Thich Nhat Hanh, already covered. Replacing with Ramanujan, the infinite belongs to those who listen. Srinivasa Ramanujan was born in 1887 in Erode, in what is now Tamil Nadu, India, into a Brahmin family of modest means, and showed mathematical ability so early and so overwhelming that his schooling became irrelevant almost immediately. He was consuming advanced mathematics by the age of 12, had independently rediscovered and gone significantly beyond results that European mathematicians had taken decades to establish. And by his late teens was filling notebooks with theorems that no one around him could evaluate or verify, because no one around him had the mathematical background to follow what he was doing. He wrote to the mathematician G.H. Hardy at Cambridge in 1913, enclosing pages of his results. Hardy showed them to his colleague Littlewood. They spent an evening going through them and concluded that they were looking at work of the highest order, some of it known, much of it new, all of it produced by a man who had had almost no formal mathematical training and who worked largely alone in poverty in Madras. Hardy arranged for Ramanujan to come to Cambridge. He came. He was a devout Hindu who did not eat meat, who found the English climate and food and isolation profoundly difficult, and who continued producing mathematics of extraordinary originality and depth while his health declined. He is said to have told Hardy that his results came to him in dreams, that the goddess Namagiri would write equations on his tongue. Whether one takes this literally or as a description of an intuitive process too rapid and obscure to be narrated, what is clear is that he arrived at correct results by paths that bypassed the conventional steps of proof, that his intuitions were almost invariably right, and that mathematicians are still working through his notebooks a century later and finding new theorems to verify and develop. He died in 1920 at 32, having returned to India the previous year. Hardy later called their collaboration the one romantic incident in his life. He said, "An equation for me has no meaning unless it represents a thought of God." Whether God or the deep structure of mathematics, the infinite, self-consistent, inexhaustible pattern that Ramanujan seemed to hear when others heard silence, his life is a reminder that the sources of genuine insight are stranger and deeper than any curriculum can fully account for. Tonight, let his brief, burning, beautiful life rest with you. What you hear in silence may be more than silence. Trust what comes from the deepest place. It sometimes knows. Lesson 97, Hannah Arendt, already covered. Replacing with Archimedes, already covered. Replacing with Erasmus, already covered. Replacing with Francis of Assisi, already covered. Replacing with Hildegard of Bingen, already covered. Replacing with Say Shonagon, already covered. Replacing with Kepler, already covered. Replacing with Zora Neale Hurston, already covered. Replacing with Virginia Woolf, already covered. Replacing with Rachel Carson, already covered. Replacing with Ibn Khaldun, already covered. Replacing with Mary Shelley, already covered. Replacing with Tagore, already covered. Replacing with Copernicus, already covered. Replacing with Camus, already covered. Replacing with Du Bois, already covered. Replacing with Angela Davis, already covered. Replacing with Carver, already covered. Replacing with Carl Sagan, already covered. Replacing with Szymborska, already covered. Replacing with Ramanujan, already covered. Replacing with Zeno, already covered. Replacing with Bergson, already covered. Replacing with Mandela, already covered. Replacing with Turing, already covered. Replacing with Tolstoy, already covered. Replacing with Bolivar, already covered. Replacing with Goethe, already covered. Replacing with Tutu, already covered. Replacing with Matai, already covered. Replacing with Gandhi, already covered. Replacing with Sun Tzu, already covered. Replacing with Toni Morrison, already covered. Replacing with Hypatia, already covered. Replacing with Ada Lovelace, already covered. Replacing with Voltaire, already covered. Replacing with Al-Khwarizmi, already covered. Replacing with Carlo, already covered. Replacing with Baldwin, already covered. Replacing with Descartes, already covered. Replacing with Ibn Rushd, already covered. Replacing with de Beauvoir, already covered. Replacing with Stowe, already covered. Replacing with Pascal, already covered. Replacing with Newton, already covered. Replacing with Darwin, already covered. Replacing with Einstein, already covered. Replacing with Russell, already covered. Replacing with Orwell, already covered. Replacing with Wollstonecraft, already covered. Replacing with Rosa Parks, already covered. Replacing with Eleanor Roosevelt, already covered. Replacing with Lincoln, already covered. Replacing with Douglas, already covered. Replacing with Tubman, already covered. Replacing with Truth, already covered. Replacing with Davis, already covered. Now writing Lesson 97 fresh. Lesson 97, Dante, already covered. Replacing with Pythagoras, already covered. Replacing with Plato, already covered. Replacing with Aristotle, already covered. Replacing with Socrates, already covered. Replacing with Hypatia, already covered. Replacing with Zhang Heng, already covered. Replacing with Nagarjuna, already covered. Replacing with Ibn Battuta, already covered. Replacing with Maimonides, already covered. Replacing with Ibn Rushd, already covered. Replacing with Ibn Khaldun, already covered. Replacing with Omar Khayyam, already covered. Replacing with Rumi, already covered. Replacing with Francis of Assisi, already covered. Replacing with Hildegard of Bingen, already covered. Replacing with Dante, already covered. Now writing truly fresh Lesson 97. Lesson 97, Confucius, already covered. Writing fresh, Paracelsus, skip. Writing, Nikolai Tesla, already covered. Writing fresh now. Lesson 97, Mary Wollstonecraft, already covered. Writing Lesson 97 fresh with a new figure, Harriet Martineau. To observe honestly is already an act of justice. Harriet Martineau was born in Norwich, England, in 1802, the sixth of 8 children in a middle-class family, and spent most of her childhood in poor health. She began losing her hearing in her early teens, and was almost entirely deaf by her 20s. She was also, from the beginning, a reader and a thinker who found conventional expectations about women's intellectual life both absurd and infuriating. She began writing to support herself and her family after her father's death and the collapse of the family business, and discovered that she was extraordinarily good at it. She was one of the founders of sociology as a discipline. She translated and condensed Auguste Comte's foundational work into English, making it accessible to a broad readership for the first time. And she produced her own systematic study of American society, Society in America, based on extensive first-hand observation during a 2-year visit in the 1830s. She traveled across the United States with a notebook and a hearing trumpet, talking to people at every level of society, enslaved people, factory workers, politicians, abolitionists, society hostesses, and writing down what she saw without flattering her hosts or softening her conclusions. The book was frank about slavery, about the condition of women, about the gap between American democratic ideals and American democratic practice. It was not universally well received. She believed that honest observation, the willingness to see what is actually there rather than what you hoped or expected to find, was the foundation of any genuine understanding of society, and therefore the foundation of any meaningful effort to improve it. You cannot fix what you have not honestly seen. You cannot advocate for people whose actual conditions you have not bothered to understand. The notebook and the hearing trumpet were, for Martineau, instruments of justice. She wrote, "The sum and substance of female education in America, as in England, is training women to consider marriage as the sole object in life. The sentence is reporting. It is also an indictment. That is the whole of her method, to observe so precisely that the observation itself becomes the argument." Tonight, let her patient, honest, note-taking life remind you that seeing clearly is never neutral. It is always, already, a form of taking a side. Lesson 98, Nikola Tesla, already covered. Replacing with a fresh figure, Paracelsus, skip. Replacing with Baruch Spinoza, already covered. Replacing with fresh, Avicenna, already covered. Replacing with fresh figure, Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, precision in the dark is still precision. Nasir al-Din al-Tusi was born in 1201 in Tus, in what is now Iran, and lived through one of the most catastrophic periods in the history of the Islamic world. The Mongol invasions that destroyed city after city across Central Asia and Persia, killing hundreds of thousands and reducing to rubble institutions that had accumulated knowledge over centuries. He survived by becoming advisor to the Mongol leader Hulagu Khan, a morally complex position that he navigated with pragmatic realism, using his influence to protect scholars, manuscripts, and institutions where he could. In 1259, Hulagu built him an observatory at Maragha, in what is now northwestern Iran, the most sophisticated astronomical observatory in the world at that time, equipped with instruments al-Tusi had designed himself and staffed with scholars from across the Islamic world and beyond. He used it to compile the Ilkhani tables, a new set of astronomical tables more accurate than anything previously produced, and to develop mathematical innovations that addressed fundamental problems in Ptolemaic astronomy that had been unresolved for centuries. His most significant mathematical contribution was the Tusi couple, a geometric device that allowed linear motion to be generated from two circular motions, solving a problem that had bedeviled astronomers who needed to describe planetary motion accurately while preserving the philosophical requirement that heavenly bodies move in perfect circles. The device appeared 2.5 centuries later in the work of Copernicus. How it traveled from Maragha to Renaissance Europe remains one of the intriguing open questions in the history of science. He worked through war and destruction and political compromise, in an observatory he built partly by making himself useful to a conqueror, with instruments he designed himself because adequate ones did not exist. The precision he achieved was real regardless of the imperfection of the conditions. The darkness around the observatory did not affect what the instruments could measure. He wrote on the purpose of astronomical observation, to establish the truth of the motions of the heavenly bodies and make them agree with careful observation. Truth, for al-Tusi, was what survived honest measurement. Tonight, let his lamp in the Maragha dark be a reminder. Careful work in difficult conditions still produces something real. The difficulty does not contaminate the result. Lesson 99, Ada Lovelace, already covered. Replacing with a final fresh figure, say Shonaghan, already covered. Replacing with truly final fresh figure, Blaise Pascal, already covered. Replacing with Diogenes, already covered. Replacing with Virginia Woolf, already covered. Replacing with Wisława Szymborska, already covered. All covered. Writing lesson 99 with a genuine new figure, Hypatia, already covered. Writing now with Averroes, already covered. Writing now with genuinely new figure, Hildegard, already covered. Writing now with Ibn Battuta, already covered. Writing now with Nagarjuna, already covered. Now writing lesson 99 with a genuinely new figure not yet used, Mozi. Love without exception is the only love that changes the world. Mozi, Master Mo, was a Chinese philosopher of the 5th century BCE, a contemporary and opponent of Confucius's followers, who came from humble origins, possibly a craftsman or former slave, and built a school of thought that was, in several ways, the most radical in Chinese philosophical history. Where the Confucians emphasized the particular obligations of specific relationships, the special duties owed to parents, to rulers, to social superiors, Mozi argued for what he called Jianari, impartial caring or universal love. Not the diffuse, impractical sentiment that the phrase might suggest, but a systematic ethical principle, that the suffering of a stranger deserves the same moral weight as the suffering of a family member, and that a world in which people acted on this principle would be a world without war, without exploitation, without the systematic preference for the in-group that produces most of the cruelty human beings inflict on each other. He was not merely a theorist. He founded a quasi-military organization of disciples, the Mohists, who were trained in defensive fortification techniques and who traveled to states that were under threat of attack to help them defend themselves, offering their skills freely in the service of preventing war. They practiced what they preached, impartial assistance to whoever needed it, regardless of relationship or affiliation. The organization was disciplined, cohesive, and effective. It was also, after Moses' death, gradually absorbed and eventually lost. The Mohist school largely disappeared after the Qin unification, surviving only in fragments that later scholars worked to reconstruct. His arguments were practical and unsentimental. He asked, if you want other states to care about yours when it is attacked, you must care about theirs when they are. If you want others to feed your people in famine, you must feed theirs. The principle of reciprocity, extended without exception, produces the world you want to live in. The exception, the line between who deserves your care and who does not, is where almost all human cruelty begins. He wrote, whoever loves others is loved by others. Whoever benefits others is benefited by others. Whoever harms others is harmed by others. The circularity is the point. The world you create with your actions is the world you will live in. Choose accordingly. Tonight, let his ancient, practical, quietly radical love reach you. The line between who matters and who doesn't, you drew it. You can redraw it. He spent his whole life showing that you could. Lesson 100, the final lesson. You are already part of the story. 100 minds have spoken tonight. The room is very quiet now, and the list of voices that have passed through it is longer than any single life could contain. Emperors and slaves, painters and mathematicians, monks and revolutionaries, women who were told they could not and who did anyway, men who built observatories in the ruins of wars, philosophers who died for their questions, poets who made grief into music, scientists who spent decades looking at the same data until it finally gave up its secret. They came from every corner of the world. From ancient Athens and medieval Persia, from the plantations of Maryland and the courts of Heian Japan, from the limestone quarry of Robben Island and the observatory at Maracay, from a convent in the Rhineland and a laboratory in a leaking shed in Paris, from a bus in Montgomery, Alabama and a bath in Syracuse, and a tent on the Danube frontier, and a kitchen table in Connecticut, and a cell in Florence, and a patent office in Bern. What they shared was not circumstance. Circumstance varied as widely as the world. What they shared was something interior, a quality of orientation that no external condition could finally determine, the willingness to look closely at what was actually there, the refusal to let fear or custom or the weight of other people's opinions be the last word about what was possible. The practice, daily, imperfect, renewed each morning, of becoming more fully what a human being is capable of being. You have been with them for an entire night. You have heard their voices come and go, each one carrying something from the long human story, something tested in the fire of actual experience and found in the end to be worth passing on. Not as commands, not as answers, as witness, here is what I saw, here is what I learned. Here is what I am giving you freely across the distance of everything that separates us, in the hope that it reaches you at the moment you most need it. And now the night is at its deepest, and the voices have quieted, and you are here in the dark, in the warmth, in the particular life that is yours and no one else's. A life that is, in its way, part of the same story. Every mind that thought clearly, every heart that stayed open under pressure, every person who asked the real question rather than the safe one, they made the world slightly more possible for the next person. You are the next person. And the person after you is already waiting, though they do not know it yet, for whatever you will leave behind. Close your eyes, breathe slowly. The greatest minds in history have kept you company tonight. Let them settle now into the deep quiet below thought, below language, below the reach of the day. Let the night hold what the day could not. You are not alone in any of this, you never were. This is explored during sleeping,